All right. So good morning, everyone. I'm so sorry again for the mix-up. We are going to proceed with the agenda this morning. We have team members that are on the old Zoom link that's omitting everyone and sharing the new link. So hopefully people will start streaming in here this morning. We do have more than 300 people signed up. And just a few really quick housekeeping for those who missed it the first time around. Our sessions will be recorded today and posted on the YouTube channel, the MHP's YouTube channel. We will have all materials available through the e-binder link, and I'm going to ask my team to post those links right now, and I'm going to make them co-hosts so that I can actually let them have them help me out here. All right, just give me 1 second. All right, thank you everyone for your patience. Teamwork makes the dream work. Okay, now I have several co-hosts that can start admitting folks in. So I just realized that people aren't getting in. Okay, so we're gonna start over. Again, everything will be recorded and posted on MHP's YouTube. And if my team could start posting the link to the e-binder with all the materials as well as the agenda for today and tomorrow, that would be great. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Lily Linke from CHAPA. Lily, I need to also make you a co-host.
It looks like I am able to share.
Oh, perfect. So without further ado, Lily Linke, MBTA Communities Manager, Engagement Manager from CHAPA. Take it away, Lily.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, MHP, for having me today. As Christine said, today I'm going to be talking about how we can eliminate barriers to broader, more inclusive participation in community engagement. I am the MBTA Communities Engagement Manager at CHAPA, the Citizens Housing and Planning Association. Today, I'll start by giving a brief introduction to CHAPA for anyone who's not familiar and the Municipal Engagement Initiative, of which I am a part. I'm going to take you through a little bit of the research from Neighborhood Defenders, looking at our current representation in community meetings, digging into what barriers exist that prevent more inclusive participation, how we can address them. We'll be looking at a case study of some work we did in Chelsea last year, quick overview of the best practices at the end, and then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A and discussion. So CHAPA's mission is to encourage the production and preservation of housing that is affordable to low and moderate income families and individuals, and to foster diverse and sustainable communities through planning and community development. We believe that Massachusetts should always be a place where our communities nourish us and help us grow. And right now, housing is the single best investment every community across the state can make to secure the future we all want and deserve. A diverse mix of homes in every part of Massachusetts plants the seeds of our long-term success by protecting our environment, improving our overall health, improving the quality of our children's education, strengthening our economy, and building wealth for everyone. The Municipal Engagement Initiative is the program within CHAPA that I am a part of. It was founded in 2018 in response to what we really saw as a lack of well-organized, well-resourced pro-housing coalitions on the ground. And so our program works to change the conversation and support existing local efforts. We recognize that every municipality is different and has its own unique challenges and opportunities. So we focus on bringing together broad, big tent coalitions to support housing. These coalitions really push beyond those usual suspects. Of course, we're expecting municipal staff, elected officials, housing advocates, developers, but we also want to bring in local business owners, civic groups like the League of Women Voters, service providers, faith groups, houses of worship, environmental and transit advocates, renters, cultural groups, racial justice advocates, and really anyone who believes that all people deserve safe, affordable, accessible housing. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the Neighborhood Defenders, which is a report that came out of Boston University by Dr. Catherine Einstein, David Glick, and Maxwell Palmer. And in this research process, they observed thousands of hours of public meetings on housing in Massachusetts. And what they found again and again is that attendees at these meetings do not represent the community as a whole. They are overwhelmingly older, whiter, more likely to be male, and more likely to be homeowners compared to the general population, and they are consistently there to oppose new developments. And these trends persist in both high and low cost cities. And opposition in wealthier neighborhoods often pushes development into lower income neighborhoods where people might not have the same capacity or ability to be as engaged. And this exacerbates gentrification and displacement. I highly recommend going to housingpolitics.com to check out more of the research, but I'll take you through a few quick data points now. You can see here, they looked at the difference between commenters and registered voters. And it's important to note that, registered voters don't necessarily represent the entire community. More generally, particularly, undocumented residents, people who are under the voting age, people who just simply aren't registered to vote. Maybe they moved there recently or they haven't done it yet. So we can see that women are underrepresented, white residents are overrepresented, and folks over 50 and homeowners are significantly overrepresented. And this has a major impact on the level of support that we're seeing, particularly for multifamily housing. You can see across all of the communities that they observed, even the ones with the highest levels of support could not quite get over that 50% threshold, which is really the bare minimum that we need to be able to see progress in our housing production. There's also significant differences in support by race and homeownership status. So we can see that white homeowners are one of the least likely groups to support new housing opportunities. Non-homeowners, white non-homeowners are slightly more likely. Black residents, both homeowners and non-homeowners, are significantly more likely than any other racial group to support new housing. But as we saw, they are frequently underrepresented in these meetings. So what are the barriers that are preventing more representative and inclusive participation in these meetings? How did we get to this point? It is often the people who would benefit most from new housing that are unable to participate. Some of these barriers include time, of course, work and family commitments. Many folks just cannot take an entire weeknight evening to go to city or town hall and participate in a public hearing. Insufficient outreach by the municipality, whether it's not doing enough direct outreach, not being creative with your outreach, using different platforms. Bureaucratic gatekeeping, it can often be really hard to navigate these different processes, particularly for larger, longer processes like a housing production plan, or if there's a major project development. There are many different steps, many different boards and committees that these need to move through, and it can be really hard to keep track of where in the process the town is, what's coming next, what opportunities to engage there are. And then just, of course, a lot of very technical language and jargon that can make it not very welcoming for people who are not entrenched in this work already. Language barriers are huge. If you don't provide translation and interpretation, people who don't speak English or don't feel confident in their English, particularly, in the case of a public hearing, are just not going to participate. A sense of efficacy, or I should say a lack of a sense of efficacy, makes many people feel like, why should I take the time out of my day to go make a comment? I feel like town staff have already made up their mind and it's not worth my time. Harassment is unfortunately becoming an increasing issue, both harassment of town officials as well as other residents. And lastly, people may not currently live in that town, which makes them ineligible to comment, but want to move there, whether maybe they lived there before and they got priced out, they really want to come back, or maybe they live in an adjacent town, they have family in town, they'd love to be closer to, but because they don't currently live in town, their opinions aren't really taken into consideration. So when we're beginning our community engagement strategizing, we want to make sure that we're always starting with who is going to be the most impacted by this. And also, who have you struggled to engage in the past? Who have you not seen participating? And really pushing yourself to reach beyond those usual suspects that you know are always going to show up. So are you making sure to reach out to renters, people of color, young people, parents of young children, people with disabilities, people with low or no income, undocumented residents, non-English speaking residents, and residents of public and affordable housing are so often left out of these conversations, whether intentionally or not. So how can we eliminate some of these barriers? At first, through our communications and outreach efforts. I strongly recommend creating dedicated project web pages, whether it's a policy that you're looking to enact. Right now, many communities are in the process of implementing 3A, the MBTA multifamily zoning changes. Having one place where people can consistently go to get updates. They don't have to bounce around the whole town page to find information scattered across different parts of the website can be a really helpful and simple way to let people keep track of what's going on. Utilizing a variety of media to inform residents, so not just those web pages, but also social media, cable access, local papers. I know those are becoming increasingly rare, but if you have them, utilize them. Flyers, online forums, using a variety of digital and physical forms of outreach. Starting with strategic advocacy, outreach to known advocacy groups. So if you have a coalition, a housing coalition in your community, or a group that you know has a vested interest in this, has a certain level of knowledge and commitment to it, reaching out to those folks early on can really help you get a wider network of people that you can reach, as well as leading on trusted organizations that might not be explicitly for housing, but thinking back to that Big Tent coalition model I talked about, faith groups, civic groups, cultural groups, social service organizations, thinking about who is doing this work on the ground in communities, who is trusted by the community, who is someone or an organization that when they speak, people listen and they take it seriously. Those are the folks you want to be really leaning on to get the word out to a broader group than the people who might already be directly engaged with the municipality. Meet people where they are, table or flyer at community events such as farmers markets, festivals, little league games. It's summertime. Summertime can often be a more difficult time to reach people and get them to show up to meetings, but there are a lot of community events. So I think it's the perfect time to get out of city or town hall and speak with people directly where they're already gathering. Translating materials into the most commonly spoken languages, of course, all your flyers, social media posts, any outreach that you're doing. Keeping your language concise and using visuals. So, if you have a flyer that's just a big block of text, people are gonna go right past it. Having something that will pop out at people, get their attention, give them the highlights, the most important pieces, and hopefully, pull them in to want to learn more. Creating a mailing list for people who are interested in a particular issue, where you can let them know we're going to have a meeting on this date and time to talk about this topic. Keeping them up to date as draft plans come out, as final decisions are being made. And if you make flyers or social media posts, including a QR code where people can register and sign up for the mailing list, or register for meetings or sign up for the mailing list. I think this is really helpful because if you see a flyer on the street, you might stop and think, oh, that's interesting. I'd like to learn more about that. But if there's no way to engage with it right there in the moment, you're going to lose people. They'll move on with their day and they'll forget about it. But if they can right there in the moment, they see the flyer, they're intrigued, they can pull out their phone, to use the QR code and sign up for the mailing list, then you've managed to kind of get them in that moment where their interest is piqued. So how can we eliminate some of these barriers through the way that we design our meetings? Offering multiple sessions on different days of the week and different times of day, I think is really important. Like I said, a lot of people can't make it out to a weeknight evening, so offering something on a Saturday morning. I've found that 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. on a Saturday is actually a time that works for a lot of people, particularly people with kids. Be thoughtful about the location where you're holding the meeting. Is it going to be an inviting location? So for example, holding a meeting at the library or an elementary school rather than a police station. There are residents who are just not going to feel comfortable walking into a police station. Is the location easy to access without a car? Do folks that use public transportation or walking, biking, are they going to be able to get there? And just simple things like providing signage so that when folks, particularly if it's a non-town hall location, people might not necessarily have never been there before, don't know their way around. So posting signs, directing people to where they need to go, making it as easy as possible for people to get there and to participate. Thinking about whether a virtual, in-person, or hybrid option makes most sense. I'm going to dig a little bit more into kind of some of the pros and cons of those later. And again, meeting people where they are. So going to those community events is a great way to do outreach, but you can also gather, sort of more informal public feedback through visioning exercises, interactive mapping activities, brief surveys, and most importantly, conversation. I think I really can't overemphasize the value of taking the time to speak one-on-one with people, hear them out, hear their concerns, hear their ideas. I think it goes a long way in terms of building trust and just having a deeper understanding of where folks are coming from and why they might have the perspective that they do. Providing resources that enable broader, more equitable participation. Food is obviously critical for people who are food insecure, but even for those who aren't, it's certainly a benefit and can be a draw for people. Childcare is extremely important for parents, particularly single parents. No one should have to hire a babysitter to be able to come to a public hearing. Translation and interpretation, and stipends for participation. Even a modest gift card can make a big difference for people. And set the stage for success. Provide fact sheets with some of the basic background that people would need to meaningfully participate in a meeting. Providing a clear explanation of the process, like what are we here to do? What are the goals of today? What's on the table, what's not on the table? I think we've all been in meetings where people, show up wanting to talk about something different or show up wanting to ask questions when it's actually a public hearing. Letting people know what can you actually expect out of this time here today so that folks don't feel disappointed or like they're having trouble following what the expectations are. And creating a code of conduct or a set of group agreements. So what are the expectations of how we're going to behave in this space, how we treat each other? And I'm going to give some examples of each of these, the fact sheets, the explanation about the process, and the code of conduct. So these are some really simple fact sheets that we have made for different events over the past few years. All of these were made using Canva. As you can see, they're quite simple. They're not winning any graphic design awards, but they get the job done of getting this information across. So on the left, you can see a template that I've created for a basic, what is affordable housing in your town? How many, most people don't actually know what the technical definition of affordable housing is. So we want to make sure that we're explaining that. What share of renters and homeowners are currently struggling to pay their housing costs? Looking at what are people in town making right now? A first-year public school teacher, a job at a local business, something in service or retail. And taking the time to calculate, well, if this is their salary, at 30% of their gross income, what would they be able to afford per month or per year? And then on the other side of this sheet, which you can't see here, I break down, well, what are the current housing costs? And then you can see how those very often do not match up. We have a sheet covering some really basic facts about accessory dwelling units that you can see are both in English and Spanish. And then an FAQ that I put together or supported our Foxborough Housing Coalition in putting together. These answers were provided by the school administration, which I think it can be really valuable to have kind of a neutral third party helping to create these fact sheets. School admins don't necessarily have any vested interest in creating more housing. And so being able to say, like, look, the folks in charge of the schools are telling us that school enrollment is not something we have to worry about, I think can be really helpful for assuaging people's fears. And again, just trying to keep those responses as concise as possible. It should be something people can easily kind of look down and reference as they're participating in the meeting. Some suggested, oh, did I skip a slide? No. Some suggested group agreements. Be fully present in the space. If you're in person, that means no screens. If you are virtual, turning your camera on, using I statements. So, you know, we can only speak from our unique perspective. Take space, make space is a little snappy way to remind people that if you are doing a lot of talking, maybe take a beat, give other people the chance to talk. If you haven't said anything yet, you know, try to get your voice in there as well. Share the lesson, not the story. So if you want to share, you know, maybe something personal about a friend you know who's struggling with housing affordability, rather than giving specific personal information about that person, share the takeaway from that story so that we're not sharing anyone's personal information without permission. And this also applies to, you know, if people are sharing personal information within that meeting, respecting that privacy when you leave and not sharing that without their permission. Assume good intent. You know, a lot of these meetings can get pretty contentious. These are very emotional issues. And certainly if someone is behaving in a way that is inappropriate or disrespectful, we need to call that out. And I'll talk about that in a little bit, but giving people the benefit of the doubt. No one knows everything, but together we know a whole lot. And think outside the box and dream big. It can be easy to get bogged down in all the nitty-gritty details of what is currently on the ground. So encouraging people to try to think beyond that, really, you know, follow their wildest dreams. Setting clear ground rules, you know, stating them explicitly at the very beginning, posting them somewhere, whether it's, you know, if you're in person, physically on a wall or virtually, putting it in the chat. Making sure you're explaining explicitly, what is this meeting about? What is the agenda? What can you expect to happen tonight? What are the goals? By the end of this meeting, what do we hope to have accomplished? These meetings are almost always part of a larger process. I don't think I've ever been to a community meeting that's just a one-off. You know, we got all of our answers in this one evening. So, you know, step out for people. Where are you in this process? What comes next? What has already happened? Who is facilitating the meeting and why? What is the relationship between those running the meeting and the project policy initiative that's being discussed, making it clear what your role in the process is. Maybe you're a decision maker, maybe you're a facilitator. Letting people know, you know, who they're talking to. Managing expectations. Will there be time for questions? Are we going to do public comment? Acknowledging tensions that may already exist going into the meeting. As I said, a lot of these meetings can be really emotional. I think it's helpful to just acknowledge that and referring back to these ground rules if you feel like they've been violated or need to be clarified. How can we prevent discrimination in these processes? Because it's one thing to get people to show up, but how can we assure that once they're there, the decisions that we're making are not being driven by discrimination? Be sure that you know the protected classes in Massachusetts. So race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, disability, source of income. Landlords cannot discriminate against someone who has a Section 8 voucher. Sexual orientation, gender identity, age, veteran or active military status, and marital status. And are you asking yourself, you know, are the potential impacts on protected classes being discussed and given their due consideration in this process? Are you creating an environment where people who fall under a protected class would feel comfortable speaking in that space? Ensuring that the decisions being made are not guided by discrimination, which will often take the form of coded language about schools, home values, crime and safety, or referring to existing public or deed restricted affordable housing as an example of the worst case scenario. I think it's important to have an ear out for this coded language because of course while people may not necessarily recognize that those thoughts are driven by discrimination, we know that in many cases they are. And being prepared to respond if you do hear these kinds of comments. And when overt discriminatory comments are made, they need to be addressed outright. So in the case of some of those more covert comments about things like home values, school enrollment, starting by asking for further clarification, because it's possible that the person just didn't maybe explain themselves very well, giving them the chance to elaborate a little bit on what they really mean. But we never repeat the discriminatory statement, even if it's just to disagree with it. We should not be, repeating that language. Finding something within the statement that you can agree on as a kind of bridge, and then refocusing to the conversation at hand. So for example, if someone says, I don't want affordable housing next to me because it's going to bring crime to the neighborhood, we can say something like, I agree that public safety is a top priority and everyone deserves to live in a home where they feel safe. Providing stable housing for those struggling with housing affordability is a critical step to improve public safety, public health and safety for everyone. And that is why we are pursuing more housing. And take note as you hear these things come up so that you can follow up on this misinformation in future meetings and get ahead of it. For more overt comments, such as slurs, hate speech, stereotyping, harassment, we have to address the comment directly. This type of speech is not acceptable. It should not be tolerated. Have a plan for how you might handle situations if they do escalate. Having a designated de-escalator who is comfortable in that role, I think is recommended so that if something like that comes up, you know whose job it is. You don't have to kind of panic in the moment. And we don't want to just brush over it and move on. We have to take a moment to acknowledge what has happened, what impact it may have had on the other people in the room, giving people the chance to speak to how it affected them. And I think particularly touching base privately afterwards with anyone who may have been affected, whether that speech was directed at them or at a group of which they are a part. It's a critical moment to repair, because if we kind of brush over these things, don't acknowledge them, don't take that moment for repair, I feel fairly confident in saying that person is never going to come back to another meeting. They will not feel safe participating in these meetings. I'll talk a bit about event formats and equity implications. Apologies, I have no idea where this green line came from. It's not part of my slides. Open public meetings. The benefits of these are that they have a broader reach. You can disseminate information widely, get direct feedback from people. If done well, they can be an opportunity for transparency and trust building. And they generally are a little less intensive to plan than some of the other forms of community engagement. But the challenges are that public hearings can be nerve-wracking for people who are new to advocacy. There are many barriers to attendance. The barriers that I listed at the beginning, I would say pretty much all of them are applicable here. No way to know who will show up if you will get truly representative participation, and they can be difficult to contain if things get rowdy. I'm sure all of us, if we haven't personally experienced it, have seen videos of public meetings that have really gotten out of control. Panels, forums, and webinars are an excellent educational tool for informing the public, doing more of a kind of deep dive informational session about these topics. Having outside experts can create a little space for planning staff. So thinking back to that, the benefit of that neutral third party of, maybe you don't trust town staff, maybe you think we have an agenda, but this person is just here to share their expertise. And you can record the event and post it on that webpage that I know you've all made for future use. So as new people come into the fold, they have that to reference as well. Challenges are that depending on the topic, the panelist, and the format, you may fail to reach beyond the usual suspects. So just like we want to see representation in the meeting participants, we also want to see that on any kind of panel or forum that we might put together. So if it's a panel that consists entirely of straight white men, we're likely not going to bring new, more inclusive participation. They can be more intensive to plan, coming up with the panelists, reaching out to them, finding a time that works for all of them, meeting ahead with them to run through the conversation that you want to have. And live interpretation can be a little more tricky if you have a lot of different people all talking at the same time. It just takes a little bit of planning of how you want to handle that interpretation. Interactive events are an amazing way to solicit direct community input on specific questions and concerns. It's a great way to build community amongst residents, neighbors meeting neighbors, having these conversations face-to-face, trust building between municipality and residents, and hands-on activities are just a really important educational tool. Most people learn better when they're actively engaged in something rather than just passively listening. It is definitely probably the most time intensive for staff. You need to set up, there's often a lot of different materials. If you're having a facilitated activity, you'll probably need more staff to be able to lead those activities. And it is more costly, particularly if you want to provide food, childcare, translation, et cetera, which I particularly recommend for more interactive events. Focus groups. The benefit of focus groups is that it can provide an opportunity for intentional outreach towards impacted groups. You could create affinity groups, for example, have a focus group that's all renters, a focus group that's all Black residents, a focus group that's all young people. And this can be a safe space for marginalized people who might feel uncomfortable in a larger public meeting due to fear of harassment, to be able to have those honest, more in-depth conversations. Some of the challenges is that you're probably going to hear some pushback from those usual suspects who are used to being the loudest voice in the room. I don't think that's a reason not to do it, but it's just something to anticipate. There is the potential for unintended bureaucratic gatekeeping. These are smaller, you're not going to reach as many people, but it's sort of a quality over quantity question. And they are certainly time intensive because these are typically, probably 2-hour conversations, and you have to have quite a few of them. Surveys are a nice kind of simple way to do broad engagement. They're easy to disseminate. You can use all those different channels to get it out to people. Folks can participate on their own time. Typically these surveys that I've seen are 10, 15 minutes at most to fill out. Translation is relatively straightforward. The challenges are that it does provide a fixed menu of options, so it's difficult for residents to express more nuanced ideas or personal experiences. So you want to be thoughtful about where in the process are you utilizing this survey. Maybe it's at the beginning, just to kind of get a big picture sense of where is the conversation at now. Maybe it's at the end, once you've narrowed down to a set of options based off of your previous community engagement. But we want to be sure that surveys are being used in addition to these other kinds of events and not in place of them. And there's no guarantee it will be representative of the community. I do recommend on these surveys asking people to share information about their racial identity, their homeownership status, their age group, so you can see these responses that we're getting, how representative are they actually of the community? And are you seeing trends of support or opposition amongst different groups? As we are planning and thinking through these various event options, we also want to be thoughtful about the format that we're choosing. So virtual meetings have become pretty ubiquitous in our lives. We're all pretty accustomed to them now. They are easier for some people to attend, like parents of young children. They can cook dinner, put the kids to bed while they're attending. And it will increase participation for some, but not necessarily new people. I'm sorry to say that our neighborhood defenders research friends went back and redid some of this research during the first year of the pandemic as we were switching to Zoom, and they found that it did not meaningfully change who was showing up. I think it just means that people who are already engaged might attend more frequently because it's a little easier to do so. You can provide live translation through Zoom, which is a great feature, and closed captioning for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. It is less accessible for many older adults. They tend not to prefer virtual meetings. And of course, it's not accessible for people who do not have internet access, which is still 15% of Massachusetts does not have internet access. In-person meetings are an amazing opportunity for community connection and trust building. Nothing beats that face-to-face, which is why I'm so excited to see many of you tomorrow face-to-face. They are often preferred by older adults. You can utilize existing spaces at no cost. You don't have to pay for a Zoom account or anything like that. And they are more interactive. You can be a little bit more creative with your meeting design and structure. Of course, there are still health concerns, particularly for immunocompromised people. It's less accessible for people with young children, people without cars, people who might have some issue with physically getting to the site, people with mobility issues. Live translation and closed captioning require special equipment. So you can't just use a little Zoom feature, you have to have the headsets. So it's just another factor to consider. And then hybrid meetings. The benefit is that you're able to serve a larger group in one event, those who want to stay home and those who want to come in person. But there are, I would say, in my opinion, they are more difficult technically to be able to set up. So they are definitely the most time intensive of all the options. You need, particular equipment, multiple staff members, someone running the screens in person, someone running the slides over Zoom. If you're having live interpretation and Zoom interpretation, microphones, you might need a camera. It's just more equipment that you do need to have, I think, in order to really pull it off effectively. And in my experience, for folks joining virtually, they don't get quite the same quality of experience as the people in person. So it is my personal recommendation to do 2 separate events, one in person and one virtual, so that each group can kind of get the full quality of that experience. That being said, MAPC has put together an amazing hybrid engagement hub that will give you all kinds of tips and tricks for how to effectively pull off hybrid meetings. So lastly, I'm going to do a quick time check because I know we started a little late. I'm going to talk about our Chelsea case study. So this was a series of sessions that we did with, in collaboration with the City of Chelsea and with some community organizations, including Green Roots, the neighborhood developers, and La Collaborativa. And this was all about educating the public on zoning, bringing new voices into the conversation, and ultimately putting together a new zoning proposal that was truly equity driven. Some of the ways that we work to eliminate barriers to participation, including holding the sessions at night at a local middle school, at a space that would hopefully be inviting and familiar to people. We provided a full meal at all 4 sessions that was catered by a local restaurant. There was on-site childcare at all 4 sessions. So we saw kids from probably 3 to 12 participating. They had different activities. We offered live interpretation. There were also bilingual facilitators. And I think it's important to differentiate because an interpreter is just repeating what the facilitator or moderator said, but in another language. Bilingual facilitators enabled these small group conversations across languages. In some cases, we had mixed language tables. In other cases, we had Spanish language tables and English language tables. But being someone who has both the skills of a facilitator and a translator is very, very helpful. We provided $50 stipends at every session. And we also sent out bilingual reminder texts and emails. So we let people tell us, there was a form where they gave us their contact information. They let us know if we had permission to reach out to them. And if they did, how would they prefer to be reached? And I think that taking that time to remind people of the dates, when the next session was, what it was going to be about, made a big difference because we had 80+ participants at every session, and the majority of participants attended multiple or even all 4 sessions. So we had a lot of people coming back each time. Session 1 was a really basic overview of zoning 101. We did an overview of the goals of this workshop series. Remember that kind of level setting. What are the expectations? What are we hoping to accomplish here? There was a presentation on the history of zoning in Chelsea and just zoning more broadly. Why does zoning exist? What are the benefits of it? We discussed some key historical events and how they have impacted housing in Chelsea today. Patterns of migration. Chelsea had a series of pretty severe fires in the 20th century, redlining, and the receivership that the city went through in the 90s. And then we had small group discussions on how these decisions have impacted people's lives. What is their current experience of housing in Chelsea, that of their peers? We handed out feedback forms at every session where we had some prompts asking people, what did you learn? Was there anything surprising to you? What do you still have questions about? Some questions that related to the topic of the session that day. And then we were able to address those questions, things that people didn't feel like we got to in that session at future sessions. That was also how we collected folks' contact information for future outreach. And these were filled out both in English and Spanish. And so then we had to obviously have the Spanish ones translated as well. Session 2 was on zoning policy solutions. So we started with a presentation on what zoning can and can't accomplish. And that was in many ways a direct response to what we found at the first session, where folks came in with all kinds of questions and concerns around housing. They wanted to talk about rent control. They wanted to talk about overcrowding in housing. They wanted to talk about creating single room occupancy housing for single people who maybe came to Chelsea to work and aren't living with a family. And so we wanted to make it clear to people, what are we actually going to be able to accomplish in these sessions, and what is the specific issue we're trying to solve. Those other things are all very important. They need to be addressed, but this is just about zoning. We looked at some different policy solutions like Boston's affirmatively furthering fair housing, Cambridge's affordable housing overlay zoning, accessory dwelling units, and parking relief, and dug into, you may recall that fact sheet example I gave that had the ADU really just bullet point high level facts in English and Spanish. That was from this session. So we had a sheet like that for each of these different policy solutions. And then again, we had small group discussions on what people love about Chelsea, what they would like to see change, and their thoughts on the policies that we had explored together. And then you can see in the photo, we had sticky boards where people answered these prompts, and bilingual facilitators took detailed notes on all of the conversations that they had. Session 3, we had a really fun interactive game that was led by the neighborhood developers. Folks split into groups, and each group was given a real parcel in the city and told to build whatever they want. So they had an aerial photo of the parcel, and we said to, dream big, no limits. You can build anything from your wildest imagination. So different Legos, the different colors represented commercial, residential, open space, parking. And of course, the group had to collaborate. Not everyone in each group wanted exactly the same thing, but they were encouraged to really build it as big and high and whatever they wanted. And then afterwards, each group shared their design with the broader group and explained their choices. What did they build? Why? What is the value in it to them? Then we gave them the existing zoning rules for that parcel and asked them to build a new structure within those limitations. And as you can probably imagine, people were very surprised and frustrated by how much the zoning limited them, having to give up affordability, having to give up green space because of parking requirements. And I think this was really helpful to illuminate for people the real confinement that zoning can create, exclusionary zoning can create, when we're not shaping our zoning to really encourage the kind of development that we want to see. At our final session, we dug more into what people do want to see built in the city of Chelsea. So participants were split into small groups, and given a stack of images of existing homes, commercial buildings, parks. You can see in the picture that stack of images. City staff and folks from some of those community organizations walked around and took pictures of different properties in the city. And we asked people to sort these images into yes and no piles for what they want to see more or less of in the city. And each group discussed why they liked or disliked various pictures, because of course, not everyone in every group had the same perspective. So it was an opportunity to dig into, well, why do you like this type of development, but not that? Bilingual facilitators led small group discussions on the built environment and what zoning or other policies are needed to make participants' dreams possible. So, if folks really liked, a larger 8-unit apartment building, talking about all the places in town that just wouldn't be possible to build. And then city staff wrapped up this last session by sharing next steps, explaining how all of this information would be incorporated into the final zoning, talking a little bit about the process to come to really help illuminate for people what role they were playing in that process and what they could expect to happen next. So we learned a lot from these sessions, but some of our key takeaways were just how important partnering with trusted local community organizations is. Green Roots, La Colaborativa, they have deep, deep ties in the community. They're trusted by the community. And I think that really was demonstrated in the number of participants that we had and the diversity of participants that we had. About 80% of folks who attended were non-English speaking. And that is very rare compared to what I've experienced at most other processes like this. Creative hands-on activities combined with small group discussions enabled a deeper level of participation and trust building. We tried to spend as little time talking at people as possible. Of course, we want to do that level setting, make sure we have a shared knowledge that we can utilize to have more productive conversations. But we really wanted to spend most of our time engaging people in more hands-on activities. People will often come to these meetings wanting to talk about something else. Like I said earlier, people wanted to talk about rent control. They wanted to talk about overcrowded housing. And, we need to keep the meeting on track, make sure that people understand what we're there to accomplish. But it's also important to take the time to speak with them one-on-one to really hear them out. We had many, staff and participants on site because we were working with so many different community organizations. And that made it possible for, both after and as the sessions were going on to have those one-on-one conversations and hear what people are concerned about. I think it does a lot for trust building and to demonstrate that people are listening and really do care about what folks on the ground are experiencing. It's also important to remember that people understand what they want to see in their community. They don't need to have an urban planning degree or to know all the jargon to be able to describe it. But visuals can be really key to bridging that gap and helping people understand how, what they love about their community, what they want to see in their community, how we can help actually realize that through this planning and these various policies. These kinds of events are time intensive to set up. Give yourself at least 90 minutes. You have to set up the food, the childcare, all the tables. If you're doing a slideshow, if you have interpretation, testing out the headsets and making sure that they're working. And then of course there's the event itself, the wrap up at the end. So all in all, you might be looking at 4 or 5 hours for this event. Like I said, these interactive kind of sessions are definitely more time intensive, but I think the quality of information that you get really does make it worth it. Create a run of show, particularly if you're working with a lot of different people like we were, so everyone knows what they're doing and when. So we had a little document that broke down, from 6 p.m. to 6:30, we're going to have food. These people should be monitoring the food table, making sure that it's clean, that people have what they need. These people should be signing folks in. These people should be, touching base with the interpreters. From this time to this time, this person's going to give an introduction. This activity is going to last for this long. And everyone who is facilitating or helping to run the event had a copy of that run of show so that we could make sure to stay on schedule and make sure people knew what they should be doing and when. I highly, if you're coordinating a dozen plus people, I think it's really necessary to do something like that. Set up the childcare ideally within view, but far enough away to not be a distraction. So in our case, the childcare was, probably only 20 or 30 feet away on the other side of the cafeteria, which is where this event was being hosted. So people could see their kids and know that they were safe, but but still be able to focus on the activity in front of them. The feedback forms were so helpful for gauging the success of the event. Did people really understand what we were trying to get across to them? What questions do they still have that we need to address in future sessions? And of course, collecting that contact information. We provided stipends at the end of the evening to incentivize people to stay for the entire event. It would be easy enough if you give it out at the beginning for someone to come and get it and leave. And at the end of the day, truly equitable community engagement is time consuming and it is often expensive, but it is so, so important to really be able to see more equitable outcomes in our planning processes. So in conclusion, these are some of my top takeaways that I hope you take from today. Understand your community context. Who are the usual suspects? I think every community probably has those 6 to 12 people that you can count on to show up at every meeting, whether they're, supportive or opponents. Who is missing and who is going to be most impacted? If we're going to be doing strategic outreach, who are the groups that we need to hear from most? Build partnerships with trusted community organizations. Like I said, having Green Roots and La Collaborativa involved in that process in Chelsea made all the difference. I feel very confident that if it had just been CHAPA and city staff, we would not have seen the turnout that we did. Learn from and with underrepresented communities, not just about them. So it's simple enough to look at the data, but if we're not engaging in these conversations and really upholding people's lived experiences as valuable information that we need to be paying attention to and having drive these processes, we are not going to have the equitable outcomes that we want to see. Meeting people where they are. I'll say that again and again and again. If you bring this information to people and make it as easy for them as possible to know what's going on, you are going to reach a much broader group than if you are just assuming that people will come to you actively seeking out the information. Make no assumptions about what people do or don't know. We really push people to, if you're going to use some kind of technical term, explain it. Just say a couple sentences about what that means. If you're going to use an acronym, spell out what that acronym means. It can be so easy, most of us spend so much of our days talking to other planners, other policy professionals. It's easy to forget that most people do not know what an ADU is, do not know what AMI means. So just taking that extra couple seconds to explain it to people so they can meaningfully participate. And also it can be really alienating if you show up to a meeting and you have no idea what anyone's talking about. It often makes people feel like they shouldn't speak because it's like, if I don't know what anyone's talking about, how could I possibly meaningfully contribute? Set yourself up for success by setting clear expectations, having those that code of conduct, provide resources that make participation not just possible, the interpretation, the food, the childcare, but easy and even fun. Ideally, we want to make these actually enjoyable experiences for people. That's going to get them to come back next time. Getting creative, thinking beyond the traditional public meeting that we are all very well versed in. And remembering that this is a practice. If these are not things that you have been utilizing on a regular basis, it is going to take some time. Don't feel like you need to do it all at once, but focusing on what can you do right now? What do you have the capacity from? What do you have the staff for? Where do you need to focus your energy? I know that most municipal staff are stretched so thin. You're working on so many different projects. And so I don't want this to feel like another big stressful thing on your to-do list, but hopefully can give you some ideas and some inspiration for how you might be able to continue to improve. So with that, I would love to open it up to questions. I see a lot in the chat. So I don't know if my friends at MHP want to feed some to me, because I don't think I can scroll through all 37 at one time.
Hey, Lily, this is Katy, Lacy.
Hi, Katy.
That was amazing. There are so many questions, but I will say we are fortunate that we had an amazing audience who promptly answered half the questions, taking you off the hook. Starting with a question from Taylor Robinson about how can we engage affordable housing opponents? And the participants had fantastic solutions. But I think that's always an issue. And you also continued to talk about that, sort of people who were just not interested, or they're opposed to it. How can you bring them in?
Yeah, I think that could actually be a really good use of the focus group. I think the tricky part of giving too much of a platform to people who are opposed to housing is you're just amplifying that message further and further. But of course, we can't ignore it. We know that it exists. These folks are residents too. They have a right to express their opinion, but I think a focus group could be a nice opportunity to be able to really dig into this with people, to understand the why behind their opposition. Ultimately, there are some folks that we are never, ever going to reach, and they will never change their minds. And so for them, really the best we can hope for is try to maintain, a friendly, civil relationship, acknowledge that, we recognize them, we appreciate their feedback. But for those who I think their opposition comes more from just a place of misunderstanding, most people are not taking the time to really deeply educate themselves on these topics. And a lot of them are quite complex. There is no silver bullet to address our housing shortage. So I think taking the time to educate people, to allay some of their fears with those fact sheets and your broader education efforts can hopefully, if done well, be successful at shifting the outlook of people who are kind of in that middle range. Like they could be moved, but they are currently maybe being influenced by opponents at present. But I do think for people who are staunchly opposed, having some of those more one-on-one conversations can be a good way to really dig into what is really at the core of that opposition.
Don't want to forget, there's a lot of interest in the zoning game and what materials were used, who paid for those materials. Clearly there was a lot of interest in that.
Awesome. Yeah, it was a great session. I would absolutely do that again and recommend for anyone to do it. Like I said, the neighborhood developers facilitated this. This is something that they've done at a number of events. So I would definitely recommend reaching out to them if you want to do this for yourself. But honestly, the materials were relatively simple. They had a lot of Legos. They had those little, Lego bases. And there was a kind of a quick explanation of the game. Yellow represents commercial, green represents open space, blue represents housing. How many, each dot on the Lego represented like 25 square feet, I think. So just some really basic kind of outline for the initial process. And then there was a sheet that was handed out that gave just kind of the basics for the zoning of that particular parcel, like height requirements, any setback requirements, parking requirements. So obviously we're not going to hand people the full zoning atlas and expect them to go through it. But since we were working with real parcels from the city, they were able to just really concisely kind of give the most important parameters for the zoning of that particular parcel. So yeah, I mean, that's the basic really. And then we also had a sheet that broke down, and I think this was really helpful for people the cost of building a unit of housing and how much the cost per unit goes down the more units you're able to build. And I think that was a really helpful, the sheet that we had said that the average to build one unit is about $800,000. And so I think that was really like mind-blowing for people, and kind of helped illuminate like, oh yeah, when we can only build single family housing, it's going to be more expensive. But the more units we're able to build, the lower the cost per unit will be to build them. Therefore, we should be able to rent them or sell them for a lower cost. So I think having that breakdown and how that played into the affordability piece was also really important for people.
Awesome. I'm gonna I think we have time for one more, and I'm wondering if you can maybe close your presentation so we can get the whole group in here. This is a tough one that we got. Someone saying, what other academic research could support your work? Now, I don't expect you to answer this right away, but I think someone is putting out a nice offer here. And I know, for instance, that the BU work has just been phenomenally useful. But if anything comes to mind, if not, we can just skip to the next thing.
Yeah, I think that's, when it comes to quantitative data, like hard numbers on the representation that we're seeing right now, I don't have any other studies I can pull from the top of my head, but I would say that it's sort of scattered information. As you look at the broader terrain, there might not be like one major study that's kind of summarizing all of it, but I think there are so many groups. Dr. Tiffany Manuel and the Case Made have been an amazing resource to CHAPA, looking at how does the way that we talk about housing impact the kind of people that we reach and the outcomes that we get. There's an amazing group that has been really inspiring to me called the Untokening, which is a group of transportation planners who are majority people of color, LGBTQ+, and they have created this group that is really for them, and that can be a safe space for them to have these conversations, talk about the unique experience of being a planner in this field who is a person of color. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of different, the Thrivance group is an amazing group in California that's doing work all around what they call dignity infused planning, really uplifting the lived experience of people on the ground who are directly dealing with housing insecurity, with traffic violence. So there are certainly, I think, for me, I've gotten a lot of my inspiration from nonprofits, consulting organizations, individuals. Tamika Butler has been an amazing resource for me. So I tend towards drawing my inspiration from community organizations rather than academic institutions, because the people who are doing the work on the ground, I think, have a very rich, nuanced understanding and often a personal lived experience of how this impacts our communities. And so I generally kind of turn to community organizations over academia.
Well, we're getting some great suggestions in the chat that other people are copying down. Maybe we should copy this chat.
Yeah.
We're just about out of time. I'm gonna personally ask a question, just reading the paper lately and the meetings in Burlington, and how are we going to proceed in a climate of fear at this point for people? Do you have any words of wisdom for sort of keeping the temperature down? Different times.
Yeah, I mean, I could certainly do a whole other session. We actually did this with the Municipal Engagement Initiative about how to handle these difficult meetings. So that's a whole other, I know the Massachusetts Municipal Association actually just had a session on this the other day. I haven't gotten the chance to watch it yet. It was at the same time as a meeting I was hosting, but I definitely plan on watching that as well. Honestly, the first thing that comes to mind is taking care of yourself and taking care of your staff. This work can be hard. It can get really personal, particularly in smaller communities. I've worked with many planners who have been villainized by their own neighbors. And I think it's important to recognize that that is hard, that is draining, it's emotionally challenging, it can get very personal. And so taking the time to take care of yourself, take care of your staff, try to manage burnout, I think is so important, because if we don't do that, we're going to see turnover. We're going to see this kind of revolving door of new staff members. And that can be a real deterrent to trust building. Having, if we can retain our planners, and I think that long-term is going to have much better outcomes. So talk to your staff, check in on them, make sure they are okay, make sure you're not over committing yourself. I think if we are coming from a place of groundedness, we will be better prepared to handle these things as they come up. Ultimately, we can't control how other people behave, but if we are able to fill our own cup and come into these spaces with kind of compassion to share, I think that we'll be much better set up to be able to handle those unpleasant moments when they come.
Well, that is great advice for life to carry us forward. So thank you so much, Lily. And we'll see this group back in 5 minutes. Actually, I'm going to hand you over to Christine. So I will say goodbye, and we'll see the group in 5 minutes.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks, Lily, for that fantastic presentation. Even though it's maybe the second or third time I've seen it, I always learn something new. So thank you again. And as Katie said, we are going to take a brief break. But in the meantime, I noticed that there's been some chatter in the chat asking if the chat itself, the transcript can be saved. So I just want to point everyone to the bottom of the chat screen. I think there's 3 dots. When you hover over it, it says more. So when you click on that, you can save the full transcript. I would advise you to do that before you leave and not now, because I would imagine we will have a lot of talk and exchange of ideas going on for the rest of the day. But in the meantime, because we were experiencing some technical difficulties this morning before we head into the break, or consider this a break time activity, we're just going to go back to some of the quick polling slides, and we will all reconvene at 10:30 for Jenny Schuetz to join us, and Callie Clark, our staff, for a facilitated conversation. So while we have you, if you are available during the break time for the next 5 minutes, please go ahead and join in on the polling activities. We'll do that now and turn on some music for everyone as well. Looks like we have folks joining us from everywhere, even out in Franklin County, the Berkshires. Got folks from the Cape. Apologize for all the doodles on the screen. I think the annotate tool is live, so folks might have accidentally annotated the screen, but it looks very pretty. You joined this poll to let us know what role you're bringing today, whether you're a housing advocate, you're a developer, you're municipal staff, or a combination of some of those, or your MHP staff. I know that we have several MHP staff joining us. Looks like we have a lot of municipal representation today. That's great. If you're a consultant, like Darwin, feel free to choose that option as well. All right, I'm going to switch over to the final question before I hand it over to Callie. And we would love to know if you have attended a previous MHP Housing Institute. I think this year we've had the most attendance, including the virtual attendance. And just to remind folks, if you would like to participate in the poll, please do so at that link above the screen, pollev.com/Madore552. Do not try and do this by touching your screen. That will not work. It's like a almost 50-50 here. It was pretty good. All right, we are at time. I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Callie. You ready for us, Callie?
Yes, I am. Good morning, everyone. So I believe in the program it says that Lisa Braxton is going to be hosting this conversation with Jenny Schuetz. So I'm going to try my best to take Lisa's place. So good morning, everyone. My name is Callie Clark. I'm the Director of Policy for the Center for Housing Data here at the Massachusetts Housing Partnership. We have a very special guest here today with us. Thrilled to be joined by someone who I think might be known by many of you, Dr. Jenny Schuetz. Dr. Schuetz is a senior fellow at Brookings Metro, an expert in urban economics and housing policy. So maybe for some of those questions about academic research papers, we might follow up with her later. She's appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, PBS NewsHour, Vox, Slate, and now the Housing Institute. We're thrilled to be part of that slate. You can read her full bio in the Housing Institute binder, and please do, because it's a wealth of information. Dr. Schuetz is the author of Fixer Upper, How to Repair America's Broken Housing System, which was released last year. And today I'm going to structure this conversation around A lot of the topics and themes she talked about in her book, use that as a jumping off point to discuss all things housing policy. And what's great about the book is it focuses not only on federal policy, state policy, but also local policy. And I know a lot of us are here today to talk about local policy. So we're going to do the best we can today in our conversation to maybe take some high level learnings and bring them down to the local level to make sure you can walk away with something that you can use tomorrow. With that, please join me in welcoming Jenny to the Housing Institute. Okay, so before today's session, my colleague Lisa Braxton had a short conversation with you, Jenny, that was actually recorded and shared via YouTube. So if someone wants to pop the MHP YouTube link in, please do. It's a 12-minute conversation. And what I was really interested in that is you talk about why you wrote your book, Fixer Upper, and really who it was written for. And I was surprised to learn that it wasn't necessarily for those of us working in the housing space. So can you tell us a little bit about who the book was written for and why you thought reaching this particular audience was so important given our current housing situation?
Sure, and thanks so much for letting me join. Callie left out the most important part of my bio, which is that I lived in Somerville and Cambridge for 7 years.
Yeah.
And I wrote my dissertation on zoning in the Boston suburbs. So if you're looking for sort of the villain origination story, that's probably it. Yeah, the book was written, I'm thrilled that MHP invited me to talk to you today and that you all are here listening to this. But you were not the target audience for the book when I started writing it because you know a lot of what's in it already. And the fact that you're taking time out of your day to be here today tells me that you already know that housing affordability is a really important issue, you care about this, and that you're working in your communities on these issues already. The problem is we don't have enough housing advocates, housing professionals, sort of self-proclaimed housers to get the kinds of policy changes we need. And so we have to make a better case to a broad segment of voters and elected officials that housing affordability and housing abundance really are top of line issues. And I think of this as sort of, if you're talking to the typical suburban homeowner who has a job and a family and a life, they're mostly thinking about their experience of housing. And if they live in a comfortable house and they can afford it, then this is not something that feels like a crisis to them. And they think of maybe people who are homeless or have high housing cost burdens as sort of another set of people, but that's not really my day-to-day problem. And I think we need to do a better job of making the case that actually our housing affordability problems are everybody's problem. And there are 3 different ways that we can do that. And it depends a little bit on who you're talking to, what they find most persuasive. So for instance, if we're talking to leaders in the business community, we might think about emphasizing it's really hard for employers to hire and retain workers when housing is so expensive. And this is definitely something Massachusetts is having issues with, that younger workers, when they get ready to buy a house, can't afford it and they move someplace cheaper, right? And that's bad for the region's labor force and economic competitiveness. One of the other things we can point out is that we have built a lot of our housing on kind of the outskirts of major metro areas, which means more traffic congestion, more commuting, and that translates into more air pollution and more greenhouse gas emissions. So if you're concerned about climate, the way we are building homes, where we build them and don't build them, is really bad for the environment. And so we should take this seriously and think about ways to fix that. And then the third reason that people should care is that housing is part of the social safety net, that providing decent quality housing in safe, healthy neighborhoods is essential for kids to grow up, do well in school, for families to be able to live in a community that meets their basic needs, for people to have their mental and physical health needs taken care of, and to be productive members of society. And all of us are worse off when we have people who live in poor quality housing, who are financially stressed, and are not able to live the rest of their lives the way they should, right? So we need to do a better job of engaging a broad audience and convincing them what we're doing now doesn't work, and all of us can be better off if we make some changes.
Great. And I think we can all take a lot from what we just heard in Lily's session and apply it to all of these situations that you're talking about. So again, I'm going to use your book kind of as like a thematic thing. So it's pretty soup to nuts in terms of all things housing policy. And I thought it was really accessible. I especially like the section on the limitations of new housing production. I think we often hear there's a narrative that if we just are building more housing to meet market demand, we'll have fixed our housing problems, right? Everything will just kind of magically become better. And so can you tell us why that's a fallacy and what you'd like us to know about how housing production fits into our housing solution?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, a big problem in places like Greater Boston, New York, much of the West Coast, is that we just haven't built enough homes to keep up with the demand created by job growth and population growth, right? And that's going to be a fundamental constraint on everything else that we try to do, because if you literally do not have enough homes for people, it's going to be hard to meet any of our other goals. But we also need to recognize that even if we allow the market to build enough homes and respond to sort of market rate needs, that's not going to solve the problem for low-income households. The poorest 20 to 25% of households everywhere in the country are spending more than half of their income on average on rent or the mortgage. And so this is not just a problem with expensive places like Greater Boston. It's also true in Western Mass. It's true in rural areas throughout New England. And this is really just a fact that a lot of people don't earn that much money, right? So wages at the bottom of the income scale have not kept up with the cost of living, the cost of construction. And so for the poorest 20% of people, we have to give them some kind of financial support, right? And I see these two things very much as two sides of the same coin. Build enough homes to accommodate all of the people who need places to live, and then provide cash assistance or vouchers or some sort of direct financial support to low-income households so that they can afford to live in decent quality homes in neighborhoods with economic opportunity without being cost burdened and have to give up on other things, right? If we think about just doing one of these, if we give people more vouchers, for instance, without building more homes, then there are a bunch of voucher holders who can't use them because there aren't apartments to rent up, right? And the existing voucher holders will not be, people who get new vouchers will not be able to use them. If we just build the homes and don't provide support, then a bunch of people are still cost burdened, right? So both of these things have to be done together.
Yeah, and later in your book, you talk about universal basic income as one of these possible solutions, again, to get more money into the hands of folks who need it. Can you give us an overview of what universal basic income is and how this could possibly be part of the solution for our housing problems?
Sure. So universal basic income is what it sounds like. At sort of the basic level, it's about giving people money without strings attached. So not something not in exchange for work requirements, but just giving people an amount of money that allows them to cover their basic needs, right? So not necessarily, that we're going to give people a $50,000 a year income, but we will give them some minimum that allows them to cover their necessities. The US has never tried this. So the universal part of it implies that we do this for everybody, right? So that everybody gets some amount of money. So far, we have only tried some really small pilot programs. Stockton, California was one of the first to do this. They got some funding from philanthropy to run a pilot program. And the idea is that rather than giving people a little pot of money for food stamps, a little pot of money for housing vouchers, and a little pot of money for some other things, we just give them an amount of money and let low-income families then set their own budget, decide how they want to spend this money, right? Their needs may vary from month to month. We just give them cash and we let them pay for things. And so far, the results seem to be of these pilot programs. This does help people pay for food and pay for rent and do what they need to do, and takes a lot of the financial stress off of them, right? They report really big improvements in mental health and physical health because they're no longer worried about juggling all of these bills that they can't afford to pay. So there's some really promising ideas, pilots that are out there. There's some difficulties with implementation, including if we actually made this universal for the entire US population, it would be a lot of money. And then you get into questions about whether you do this instead of things like vouchers and food stamps, or whether it's an addition. So the implementation will be tricky, and we're not really having a serious national conversation. But I think it is worth, if any of you are kind of in the philanthropy space, doing some pilot programs, seeing how they work, this can be really helpful.
Yeah, and I know in Massachusetts, we have seen some pilot programs, especially in the beginning of the COVID. So if anyone knows of a pilot that happened in your community or in a community around you, pop it into the chat so we can have a little bit more of a conversation about that. And if you saw, was this helpful? Did this work? How did it impact housing issues in your community? I also know that a local research organization, Boston Indicators out of the Boston Foundation, has done a piece of work looking at universal basic income and what that would mean for Massachusetts. So for anyone who's interested in exploring that, I would encourage you to do that. And again, I can pop a link in the chat later. So getting back to affordable housing and the production of affordable housing, we've talked about universal basic income, we've talked about vouchers. Where do you think other subsidies for affordable housing, particularly on the production of affordable housing, fit into this conversation around the need for production?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is going to be, it depends on what kind of market we're looking at. So, if you think most of the country, and, Massachusetts is atypical because it's very expensive and has been supply constrained for a long time. But in large parts of the country, particularly in sort of Sunbelt places, the cost of construction is pretty close to the direct inputs, right? The labor and materials. And most households, most middle income households can afford decent quality housing. So in places like that, building more housing and providing financial support, right? There are a bunch of places that have high enough apartment vacancy rates that if we just gave poor people vouchers, they would be able to rent up apartments. And most people would be taken care of, with maybe some special populations. So there are large parts of the country where actually that would be a perfectly reasonable solution. In places like Boston, and I'm thinking really about kind of the core, right? So the inner core, Boston, Cambridge, in places like New York City and San Francisco for sure, there is such high pressure on land values that even if we built a ton of housing, it's still likely to be pretty expensive, just because these are very productive places. Land costs a lot of money. And so I think there's a stronger reason to say we should have some housing that is owned or operated and financed by either public entities or nonprofits. And this is also where it gets sort of tricky prescribing kind of generally who should be doing this, right? So, for instance, the Boston Housing Authority and the Cambridge Housing Authority have, great reputations for managing their properties and delivering high quality housing, right? Would they be interested in owning and providing more traditional public housing? Possibly, right? And is that something they could do as their portfolio? But there are lots of places in the country where the public housing authorities are mostly voucher administrators, and in some places where they have not done a great job with their public housing, right? So I live in DC. The DC Housing Authority is under multiple lawsuits for poor quality housing, unlivable housing that tenants are living in. This has been a problem for decades. They've had management problems. And it's really hard to imagine the DC Housing Authority building more traditional public housing and being able to operate that well, right? So, there it might be something like subsidies to nonprofits, or even potentially for-profit developers who get ongoing operating subsidies. So this is sort of a circular way of saying there's some places where expanding traditional public housing might work. There's some places where LIHTC works pretty well. There are also places where LIHTC is really, really expensive. In California, the cost of building a LIHTC unit is up to close to $1 million per apartment in the Bay Area, which seems like maybe not the greatest use of our subsidy funds when there are many places in the country where you could give, you could literally buy people houses for less than that. So this is a hard one to come up with a national prescription, but I think, figuring out the capacity of your local public agencies, nonprofit providers, construction costs, and sort of the vacancies, you can figure out what package might work well.
Yeah. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, LIHTC is the Low Income Housing Tax Credit. So that's a subsidy that goes in to help build affordable housing across the country, and especially here in Massachusetts. And maybe before we keep going, I'd love, again, since you said you were a Massachusetts resident, you've studied local zoning, what makes Massachusetts an outlier in terms of housing, both for good and bad things? I think we do a lot of great things and we have a lot of challenges. From your national perspective, how do we compare to other places?
So two things in particular stand out about Massachusetts. One is that it's expensive, and this is not news to any of you. both in terms of the sort of the absolute housing costs and also the ratio of housing cost to income. Massachusetts is among probably the top 5 or 6 states. The good news is you're not as bad as California and you're not as bad as New York City, but those are pretty high bars in terms of being very unaffordable. And it's not even across the state. I mean, this is essentially a problem of Greater Boston and the Cape, which is its own kind of unusual ecosystem. The other thing that really stands out about Massachusetts housing is that it's very old. Again, not surprising, it's an old state. You had a lot of population growth in the early part of the 20th century, but more than a third of the housing was built prior to 1940. Some of those homes are well maintained and in good shape and have been rehabbed, but a lot of them aren't. So you have a lot of existing housing that is old, that is not very energy efficient, that has pretty high maintenance requirements. And some of that is because the state has grown slowly, and so you've not built a ton of new housing. Some of it's because the regulations make it hard to replace older housing with new housing. And so I think those are sort of the 2 challenges that the state has to deal with. In terms of a kind of the good outlier, and I will say, the reason you don't have enough housing and it's expensive and you're not replacing your old housing is because local governments, particularly the most affluent suburbs, have made it really hard to build, right? I wrote my dissertation on zoning in the Boston suburbs, and some of them have come up with just incredibly creative ways to make it impossible to build anything except a $2 million single family house, right? Which is going to be unaffordable to most people and overall results in much less housing than those places need and would have otherwise. I will say Massachusetts also has an amazing ecosystem of public agencies and nonprofits that are thinking about how to fix this. So you have lots of nonprofit providers, you have lots of policy innovations. I'm a huge fan of the MBTA communities. I think this is a great model for other states across the country. We're certainly watching to see how the implementation plays out, but I think that's exactly the right kind of state level engagement. Chapter 40B has helped over the years bring more multifamily rental housing into places that otherwise wouldn't build it. So it's better than if 40B didn't exist. On the other hand, it hasn't fixed the underlying problem, which is that too many of the suburban communities are incredibly restrictive and just don't allow housing under a more straightforward process.
So I'm glad that you brought up transit-oriented development. That's where I was going. And I did just want to note that several years ago, we did a presentation called Illegal Neighborhoods here at the Housing Institute, which for all of you planners out there, I'm sorry I said illegal, I mean pre-existing non-conforming, which is basically looking at neighborhoods and across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that could not currently be built under our current zoning, right? And these were a lot of places that we love, that are walkable, that are dense, that have goods and services nearby. You can pop in and grab a coffee. There's a library down the street. And so when we start to talk about transit-oriented development in MBTA communities, to me, it's really that continuation of this history of Massachusetts and how we used to build in some communities and how can we continue that. So, can you tell us why TOD is so important to the country as a whole? Maybe let's start there and then we'll zoom into Massachusetts and talk about that.
So TOD is actually not that much of an issue nationwide because a lot of the country doesn't have public transit or sort of well-functioning transit systems. So again, this is a great feature of Massachusetts that you guys have not just the T, but you have rapid bus transit, that you have commuter rail. And so you have a fantastic transit infrastructure. Places that have this transit infrastructure offer the opportunities for people to do more of their daily needs, not just commuting, but errands and socializing and getting around without needing to drive a car, right? And so and transit infrastructure is expensive to build, it's expensive to maintain. Public transit only works when you have a lot of people who are close to the transit stations. So we want to maximize both the number of jobs, the number of homes, and things like shops and retail and restaurants within walking distance of your transit corridors. So think not just about the stations, right, but the entire corridor, right? That's really where you get the biggest bang for your buck in adding more housing because people are able to do so much of their daily life without needing to drive, right? We know that we have to reduce vehicle miles traveled to meet our greenhouse goal emissions And the only way we're going to do that is by concentrating economic activity of all kinds near transit and building things that are close together, right? So homes next to stores is another way to get there. Even if you're not close to transit, this proximity is really, really helpful. And it's also it's a nice way to live, right? It's great for people to be able to walk out their front door, go to a coffee shop, drop off their dry cleaning, drop off their kids at school without having to get in a car and drive and park someplace. So it just makes for a really convenient lifestyle. And I will say that, Boston is thinking productively about how to use their transit infrastructure. So some of the mapping work, for instance, showing transit stations that have lots of empty space around them or have low density housing or parking lots. That's the first step to figuring out where is your underused land and how can you make better use of that, right? And so, I think this is fantastic that you guys are trying to mobilize this. Thinking about how to use that land better, thinking about how to provide guidance to localities about how they can use that land better. There are a number of other places around the country, mostly the big cities that have legacy transit systems that are also thinking about how to do this well. The other nice thing about the MBTA communities is that this is really where one of the state's guiding interests comes in, because the state provides subsidies for the transit system. So it's one of the areas where their interest is strongest in getting more riders onto transit, especially during the work from home era. And the way you do that is by coordinating your land use better.
Yeah. And I know that you did some work with, again, our friends at Boston Indicators in 2020. You wrote a piece called Zoned Out, Why Massachusetts Needs to Legalize Apartments Near Transit. I recommend that anyone take a look at this piece. And it sounds like your wish came true with MBTA communities. I think that came out in November of 2020, and MBTA communities was part of a bond bill that was released in January 2021. So just continuing on this theme a little bit, why is this a unique moment for Massachusetts to envision a different reality for future generations on housing issues? I mean, again, I'm a millennial. Housing issues are just kind of part of our DNA at this point. How can we use this opportunity of MBTA communities or other opportunities to just make it easier for the next generation?
Yeah. So if the implementation goes well, and there are promising signs so far, MBTA communities can help in at least 3 different ways. So one is just on the total number of homes, right? So if you think about, we featured Wellesley in the case study. It's easy to pick on Wellesley, right? So they have very low density development around most of their commuter rail stations, which means that there aren't that many people who can live within walking distance of the station, right? If you change the zoning to allow townhouses, low to mid-rise apartments, you can just get more homes, right? Which the state needs overall. So more housing production. You can also get smaller homes that are lower cost relative to what the homes are, right? And the numbers here, you have to get yourself in context, right? So the median existing home in Wellesley, sells for something like $1 million. You can build townhouses for maybe $800,000 and condos for maybe $500,000. That's not cheap, but it's cheap compared to the housing that's already in Wellesley, right? And so the idea is if you can build smaller homes using less land in those expensive places, you can not only get more total homes, but the price is cheaper or the rent is cheaper. And so people who can't now live in places like Wellesley would be able to move in. Right. So whether they're looking for access to public schools or just a nice place to live, or this is closer to their job, this enables more people with lower incomes to move into the expensive and exclusive places. And then the other piece we've already talked about, which is that building housing strategically close to transit corridors and close to Main Street's commercial areas lets people reduce their driving, lets them do more of their errands without needing to get in a car. And this has climate benefits and lifestyle and health benefits as well.
Okay. So another topic that's really relevant for this group is, so we zone for more housing, we're building more housing. This is great. Who's paying for all of the infrastructure that comes along with new housing, right? So you talk about examples of infrastructure. It's water, sewer, but it's also parks, libraries, roads and sidewalks, childcare facilities, right? All the things we need for a vibrant community. And one of the things that's a challenge is that this is all necessary, but the responsibility to pay for these goods and services is often at the local level. So can you talk us through why that is, and maybe why it might make sense to shift some of this, or at least share the cost of this needed infrastructure with state and federal governments?
Sure. So on the question of why local governments pay for an awful lot of infrastructure, it's essentially a policy choice that the US decided that local governments, in particular, that local governments are responsible for paying for K through 12 schools. That's actually pretty unusual compared to a lot of other rich countries where funding for K through 12 schools comes from the federal government or from state governments and essentially is equal per kid. And that turns out to be one of the big drivers of sort of opposition to housing, and especially affordable housing, is that local governments would prefer not to have a bunch of poor kids living in their community and then have to pay for educating them. On top of that, the other things like parks, some amount of transportation, so maintaining roads and sidewalks, libraries, things like that. The US just made a decision that that's going to be the responsibility of local governments. The thinking behind that is that local governments can better assess what level of services their residents want. So we'll have some communities that have higher taxes and more services, and other communities with lower taxes and fewer services. The distortions come in the ways we pay for things. So property taxes is still the main workhorse of local government revenues. Property taxes get assessed on all residential commercial properties. In theory, the way this should work is you have, say, an open space area, agricultural land or undeveloped land, or maybe some industrial land that's not being used intensively. If you convert that to housing, to mixed use, to retail, to office, that increases the value of the property. So it puts more demands on services. You have more people who need things, but also brings in more money in property tax revenues to the local government. And it's true still that most new development does pay for itself in property taxes. But there can be some exceptions for that. There may be particular kinds of developments that put a special demands on services. Massachusetts also has some constraints on its property taxes that you have chosen to impose on yourself. So you may not be getting the full property taxes, particularly for longstanding properties. And just politically, a lot of local government officials would love to be offer better services to their residents without asking them to pay more in taxes. And so there has been a huge trend since about the 1960s towards relying on impact fees to pay for improvements to infrastructure rather than broad-based tax increases. Impact fees mean that the developer has to pay money up front or put in the services, so pay to put in the water and sewer improvements, pay to expand the sidewalks, sometimes even pay for sort of parks and bike lanes that may not be directly connected to the new development. And so there's some places in Massachusetts that sort of ask developers to pay for a bunch of stuff that's not really about the new housing. It's about increasing the quality of services to existing residents. And that's just kind of a sneaky way to kind of make things easy on your current residents, who, by the way, show up and vote, whereas the people who don't live in your community yet don't get to vote there. And Amy Dane, those of you who are familiar with her work, has done some great work on this, looking at the negotiations. And, in some cases, local governments ask for more than the developer's willing to pay, and they walk away and don't build. And that means the existing residents don't get the benefit of better services, right? So this negotiation is kind of a dangerous game. If it works out well, you get better services without paying for it. And if it works out badly, you don't get anything out of the deal, right? And particularly the bad thing about impact fees is that it's extra costs on top of the cost of construction that get tacked onto newly built housing. So imagine that it costs $400,000 to build a house, and you tack on impact fees of $100,000. You've just raised the price of admission to the community because of the impact fees, right? And so this is one of the reasons why communities get wealthier over time, because the price of housing is going up because they're tacking on these extra impact fees.
And is this just a Massachusetts issue? I mean, when we're talking about ways to potentially share these costs, bring it from the locality to potentially the state and federal level, do you have examples of places in the country where this has been successful, or even to the county level? Another thing I think makes Massachusetts really unique is that we don't have a strong county level government. So across the country, you know, there is that more of a focus on regionalism, and here we're really focused at the municipal level. So do you have any examples from across the country that you could share?
Yeah, so Massachusetts isn't unique in relying heavily on impact fees. We do tend to see this more in places that have restrictions on their property taxes, right? So California's Prop 13 is a good example, Colorado as well, and Massachusetts Prop 2.5. So that's one of the things that sort of pushes localities to use what we call fiscal zoning. The other thing is that it's not so much that the absence of county governments, but that so many of the cities and towns are really small, right? So a lot of the public services are inefficient to operate at small scale. You know, think about operating a school system and police and fire and water and sewer for a community that has 5,000 to 10,000 people, right? So it's just not an efficient scale of provision for a lot of this. And there are a lot of these smaller communities. So, you know, voluntarily agreeing to work with your neighbors and share some of the costs of this stuff would be one option. I think there's a really strong argument for state governments to provide more grants for communities that are willing to provide more housing and more diverse housing to offset the costs of things like additional schools, additional transit infrastructure, you know, whatever the infrastructure that makes the housing work, the state can provide at least some kind of a matching grant on that as an incentive for localities that are genuinely worried about the fiscal impacts, right? And there's a strong argument to do that, particularly in places that don't have the resources. You know, should Massachusetts be offering to offset the costs of, you know, Wellesley building some apartments and maybe needing to have another school? That one's a harder one to make, right? But for sort of middle and lower income communities, sharing the revenues and, you know, getting some assistance makes a lot of sense. I will say that now is a great time for local governments to be thinking about their infrastructure needs because there's some big pots of federal money. And so you probably are aware of this, the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act both have money for infrastructure, and particularly for anything that's going to be green infrastructure and improve energy efficiency. You know, so this is a one-time chance to get stuff paid for outside of your own budget and outside of your own residence, and you should be looking at those.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the sessions that we have tomorrow, we're going to talk about these opportunities. I know Laura Schuetz is hosting a session specifically on public land. You brought that up earlier. How can we utilize public land? So for anyone who's attending tomorrow, there's going to be a lot of great stuff on all of these issues that Jenny's talked about, and then how we all can work towards actually creating the housing we need, knowing these constraints that we have. So I have a few more questions, and then it looks like there are several questions in the chat, so I want to make sure we have time for that. So the end of your book focuses on moving past the limits of localism, which I think we've talked a lot about, but also the political challenges involved in achieving better housing outcomes, policies, and then outcomes for all, right? And you talk about local control, which is good or bad, depending on if you have the power or if you want the power. And you also talk about existing policies that really created winners and losers, and winners oftentimes want to maintain the status quo. Though everyone here today is interested in changing the status quo. That is my assumption. So Lily's session, again, just went into a lot of detail about how to engage with coalitions, maybe partners that you wouldn't think to engage with. What kind of advocacy would you encourage? You know, what do we need to see in order to break down this winners and losers and make real change at the local level?
Yeah, so I'll take sort of two different angles on that. One is that some of the winners from the current system are probably not going to come around. It's like one of the just big splits that we actually don't talk about that much in politics is just the difference between homeowners and renters. The US has spent a lot of time and thought and money building up a system of homeownership and encouraging wealth building through homeownership, both at the individual level and community level, and subsidizing homeownership, right? Explicitly through the federal tax code, through things like the mortgage interest deduction, implicitly through things like highway spending, which encourages people to move out to the suburbs and drive, And so, suburban homeowners are big winners under a bunch of the current policy systems. Most of them don't think of themselves as benefiting from government subsidies, right? I buy a house, I drive my car. Why is that, a subsidy? And it's unlikely that we're going to sort of convince them that they're takers from the system and that they should maybe be okay with leveling the playing field with renters and people who ride transit. It's just a hard argument to make. And so one of the biggest constituencies in favor of the status quo is the median suburban homeowner. There are a lot of them, right? So going back to sort of my opening point, we can make some cases that there are some big social costs to our current system, but it is also true that people who live in big suburban houses and drive SUVs may have to pay more for their lifestyle, and they're not going to like that. So we should be realistic about sort of how much we're going to be able to make political inroads. I do think that there is more potential for alignment of existing coalitions who haven't necessarily seen the overlap. So I talked some about the pro-housing movement or abundant housing movement. You have a great statewide organization, Abundant Housing Massachusetts. You have a bunch of great local organizations that are pushing for these sort of zoning changes to make it easier to build housing. Those are quite new, and they're strategically trying to reach out to an older set of organizations that organize around more funding for low-income housing, right? So advocates for tenants, advocates for more voucher funds, more LIHTC funds, the affordable housing community and industry, right? Those necessarily haven't always been aligned with the zoning reform movement, but we're starting to see much more of that. And I think that's really helpful. Certainly when you talk to nonprofits who build affordable housing, they recognize you can't build a LIHTC project in a place where zoning prohibits market rate apartments, right? So more funding, zoning reform really do go hand in hand for the production side. Tenant advocates, some of them are willing to align, some of them are concerned about displacement, finding ways to have those conversations and make sure that there are policies in place to protect tenants. Climate groups are a really interesting part of the puzzle too. In some places, environmental groups have seen dense development near town centers and transit is really important, and they can align with that. Then there are places like, the Sierra Club of California, which basically says people should just stop having kids because people are bad for the environment. And if we build more homes, then we will encourage people to have more kids, so we shouldn't build more homes. I find that a really counterproductive stance. It turns out not building homes doesn't discourage people from having kids. It just makes it more expensive. But finding sort of areas where you have some overlap there, I think is really important. Civil rights groups have gotten engaged with this as well. Exclusionary zoning that bans apartments is very much rooted in trying to keep Black and brown people out of expensive white communities. And so there's a very clear civil rights and a fair housing issue that can be brought here. So those are kind of the pieces of the puzzle. But it's hard. This is a relatively new political movement. We are just getting on the radar of sort of typical suburban communities that things maybe need to change. It's going to take a while to educate people, to bring them along. There's sort of a hardcore of NIMBYs who will fight this to their dying breath. The good news is they're not necessarily that big, right? It's a very vocal group and very visible and often politically well connected, but it's not a majority, right? And so we're seeing more and more, both from polls and from referenda, and just from who gets elected to local and state office. People are broadly supportive of building more housing and tackling these challenges if you can get elected officials to understand they may have a majority support for this, and the minority of really loud NIMBYs need to be put in their corner. Like, don't let them run the conversation because they're not representative of voters overall.
All right, these are my last two lightning round questions. So as we said at the top, the audience here today, all 199 of you, it's full of local volunteers, officials, nonprofit organizations. That's just the beginning of, we have a really diverse group of folks here today. What would you say to this group that is fighting hard specifically to build affordable housing in their communities? And what are some lessons they can take from your academic research and implement them in their everyday lives to build the housing for the folks that need it?
So one of the most important things you can do is have conversations with the people you know in your life who either aren't mostly with the people who aren't engaged with this, right? So trying to convince your hardcore NIMBY uncle is probably not a great use of your time, but a lot of the people in your life just don't think about this. Talk to them about what you do and why you're doing that. Meet people where they are, right? I understand you love your neighborhood the way it is. You're worried about change. You're worried about displacement. Let's talk about what we can do to fix that. Let's talk about the concrete things that we can do to address your concerns and talk about the benefits to all of this, right? These person-to-person conversations with people you know are so much more effective than flyers and mailers from advocacy groups. And so the more you can engage with people, meet them where they are, and tell them why it is you're doing the work that you do, the more people we bring over to our side.
Okay. All right, and my final question before I think we open it up to the audience is, when should we expect to see change? And I'll back this up a little bit, right? So we've talked a lot today about zoning and housing production, but this doesn't happen overnight, right? Especially if we're talking about zoning, we're talking about 10, 15 years in the future, we might be see something different, but that doesn't help folks that are struggling today. So what can we do, or what should we all be thinking about in the short term in order to complement some of the longer term strategies that we've discussed here today? Or when should we expect to see some change? Give us some hope here at the end.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll hedge a little bit. So the zoning change doesn't have to take decades to start making positive impacts. And we do see places that are willing to move fairly quickly to get their regulations revised. If there is strong demand, as soon as the new rules are in place, and actually even before, like, developers will want to build in these places, right? So it takes a while to get enough new supply online that you see a meaningful impact in rents and prices, but new units can start coming online pretty quickly, and we should try to get this done fairly fast, right? Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Figure out something that is incrementally better than your current rules and go do it. And then you can build on that and build on that, right? Land use planners have a tendency to think, I'm going to revise my zoning and it's going to be in effect for the next 50 years. We need to get comfortable with doing incremental changes faster and being more responsive to changes in the market, right? That's true on other dimensions too. Things like if you've got vacant office space that's not going to be used now that we have more people working from home, look at the range of building code regulations and fire safety that would make it easier to convert those into housing. Homelessness is a great area actually to do some quick experimentation, right? So figure out how to get units up online, homes that are better than people sleeping on the streets. We need to get more comfortable with experimentation, with trying things, with learning from our successes and failures, and with being more flexible. That's really hard for the public sector. We tend to be very small c conservative, change resistant, worried about getting things wrong, but we really need to try to do things faster and be more responsive. Now is a great time, as I said before, to tap into some federal funding sources. If you still have any ARPA funding left around, that's a great use of it. Think about some pilot programs, think about how to deploy that, put it in an affordable housing trust fund. So it's going to take a while before we chip away at sort of this big deficit of homes, but we can start seeing incremental progress. And I think it's also really important to tell those stories, right? You allow some apartments near your commuter rail station, you get a building up and it leases up and the people who live there are happy to be there. And guess what? The world hasn't ended because there are some apartments, right? Tell that story and then figure out how to build on that and how to expand on that.
I believe my colleague Shelley has been moderating the chat, and I'm just wondering, yes, Shelley, if there are any questions that you want to raise right now while we have Jenny.
Yes, thank you so much, Callie. Your questions were fantastic, and Jenny, it's so great to have you here. There has been a lot of conversation in the chat, not so many questions, but a lot of comments and reactions and feedback, but some themes. And going back to the beginning of the conversation, there were a variety of comments around acknowledging that we have people in our communities that aren't really inclined to be empathetic about the economic suffering of our neighbors, of other people. And I'm wondering, Jenny, if you can just offer some language that folks may be able to use in their communities to help address that and help people understand why the economic suffering of some does impact all of us?
Yeah, it's this is going to depend on who you're talking to. People who are comfortable saying out loud, I don't care if they're homeless people, that's their problem, not mine. It's going to be hard to bring them over. But I think most of us have some level of empathy. And explaining to people, I think, how expensive housing is, it's not just very poor people, right? And there's sort of a misconception that a lot of people who are poor, who have housing cost burdens, even who are homeless, that they're all unemployed, right? And they have mental health and addiction problems, and that's why they can't afford to pay rent. Housing has gotten so much more expensive in the last 20 to 30 years that we have a lot of people who are working full-time, often multiple jobs, who are still cost burdened, right? In the really expensive places, we have people who are working full-time minimum wage jobs who are homeless because that's not enough to pay the rent, right? For me, one of the strongest arguments too is we have a lot of kids living in poor quality housing that causes real health problems and very financially stressed families. Like the kids didn't choose to be there, right? But these are our workers of the future. These are our citizens of the future. Even from a purely self-interested standpoint, we are not better off as a society with having a bunch of kids who are growing up in poor housing conditions, right? This is an investment in our future that we all need to take really seriously. And certainly if you live in a community that has a large homeless population, it's not pleasant for anybody, right? It's terrible for the people who don't have homes. It's difficult for small businesses nearby. It's difficult for local governments who are trying to figure out how to deal with public health problems. Nobody likes walking by a homeless encampment, right? We're all better off when everybody has a decent quality house and everybody has a home to go home to.
Thank you. Another theme was around the impact on short-term rentals in our communities, particularly in certain parts of the state like Western Mass and Cape and the Islands. And one person even asked, at what point might we regulate investment ownership? Do you ever see that as happening, or how it might happen?
So there's a lot of interest in this, and particularly in places that have second homes, vacation communities, this has become a real issue. I will say from just a purely practical standpoint, it's really hard to do this well. So you can't ban people from buying a second home. You can try to enforce short-term rental rules, but it takes a lot of public resources to enforce it. And so, think about what you're committing yourself to doing if you want to do this. The other thing is that there are a couple of reasons why we wind up with this. In some places, the demand for short-term rentals reflects that there aren't enough hotel rooms, right? And so providing more hotels, making it easier to build hotels in places that have a lot of seasonal visitors would actually help with that. We have seen that places that try to discourage people from creating accessory dwelling units, which are often used as Airbnbs, have some downsides too. Some people will create accessory dwelling units for short-term rentals, but some of them also create it for long-term rentals or just to create another space for somebody who's looking for a place to live. We don't want to discourage adding more housing units, right? And so, the restrictions on that may have some unintended consequences. That said, the rich people are going to have multiple homes, and it's pretty much impossible to stop that. So we have to be realistic about what we're going to be able to do and figure out if that's where you want to spend your policy energy.
Thank you. Someone has put out community land trust. Do you see that as a one part of the solution, or something that may help our housing crisis?
So we need all the tools we can get, and community land trusts have been around for a while. They can be used for a couple of different circumstances. Typically they've been used in places that have high vacancy rates. So places like Cleveland and Baltimore, where it's really used to sort of take ownership of vacant properties, vacant lots, and hold them until there's a demand for redevelopment. There's more interest now in using them to own and maybe even develop land that can be used for sort of income restricted housing. We'll say that there's limited demand, particularly on the ownership side. Things like limited equity co-ops and community land trusts that cap the appreciation you can have. Most people, when they buy, they want to have the upside. So it's worth exploring this. We haven't ever seen them go to scale, but in some communities, it certainly can be part of the solution.
Fantastic. Someone has brought up the new energy codes, and do you see any impacts on housing development, specifically affordable housing development with new energy code?
So I don't know the specifics in Massachusetts. I mean, in general, energy efficiency, new buildings are more energy efficient than old buildings. And I'd say the biggest focus for Massachusetts is probably, either retrofitting or replacing some of your older housing, because that's so much of the housing stock, right? With affordable housing, sometimes this comes down to, how much more is it going to cost to do the energy efficiency upfront in construction versus how much is this going to save you in operating costs over the long run. The transition to clean electricity is happening pretty quickly. And so, replacing a bunch of the gas heating systems and gas stoves, at some point, that's going to save you money. It may not be now, it may be 5 years from now or 10 years from now. I think some of the funding sources make it harder to do, more expensive today for lower operating costs later. So I think probably on a project by project basis, you have to make that decision.
Someone's brought up the idea of schools getting into the housing development field. And I've seen recently California has made it more simple for school districts to build housing for staff. Do you see that as an option nationally or for Massachusetts?
That's a tough question. Most school districts don't want to be real estate developers or property managers. It's not their core business. I think probably the better way to think about this is, do school systems and other kind of public entities own land that could support a mixture of housing and other things, right? So we've seen this with some libraries, for instance, that where you have a library, if you can add apartments on top of it, you already own the land, and that's usually a great location to do this. With K through 12 schools, sort of co-locating housing on the campus is often not great, but the school system may own, like parking lots where they have the school buses or something like that. Housing for teachers is a popular program, but you also then have to sort of deal with, why are you subsidizing housing for teachers and not for other professions? Or even, why are you subsidizing housing for public sector employees and not for private sector employees who earn roughly the same wages? So politically, that can often be kind of dicey territory.
Yep, and also fair housing challenges as well.
Yes.
I was also just going to add, I'm going to guess this person's question too is, recently there have been some articles about something called the Dover Amendment, which allows academic institutions, so not the K through 12, but our higher education institutions who often have a lot of land, right? We can think of several places, maybe in Cambridge, that have a lot of land, and thinking about how to utilize that land for housing purposes, again, because often there's a concern about students spilling out into communities, pushing families out of housing that was originally built for families, and now it's becoming student housing. But I think maybe that's also what that person was talking about. Do you have any reactions to that?
Yeah.
Higher education situation?
I would love for universities and colleges to provide more student housing. That would be really helpful, especially in places where there's a concentration, because it's true. Students often can outbid non-students for housing. They're willing to live with 5 roommates. They're already taking on debt, so they don't mind taking on more to pay for a decent apartment. Universities should not increase the size of enrollment without increasing the amount of student housing. They just shouldn't. There's some liability issues. They don't necessarily want to be landlords either, but that seems to me like a perfectly reasonable request. You have more leverage with your public educations with the UMass system. I don't know that you're going to be able to force Harvard and MIT to add more student housing. I mean, if I could upzone all of Harvard Yard and build stuff on it, I would, but unfortunately I don't have that authority. But I think it could make a big difference. Faculty housing and staff housing, which rarely gets talked about, or the other areas, most of the people who work at universities are not well-paid faculty. They're staff who don't earn a ton. And universities, when they provide subsidies, it's for their best faculty. And so the people who need it the most are not getting that. That's an equity issue. How you fix that, you're not going to have a lot of levers on that, but I think it's certainly worth a conversation.
Thanks, Callie. So there's just a couple other more things that I'd like to bring up. One is getting into the issue of wastewater capacity in communities. And apparently on the South Shore, we have some communities that actually have moratoriums on wastewater capacity. And frankly, we've been in communities over the years that resist capacity because as a way of resisting development in general. Wondering if you have any thoughts on this and responsibility on state partnership, requiring communities to do more, any thoughts that you might have, or what some of our audience might be able to use locally in this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question because you do have places that have chosen not to put in town water and sewer, and then are able to say, oh, I can't build apartments, we don't have town water and sewer. And for wealthy communities that choose not to make the infrastructure in order to push off housing, you know, I'd love to see the state be a little bit more aggressive with them. You know, you can offer some carrots to sweeten the deal, but there's no reason that Weston can't put in full water and sewer and then build a ton of apartments, right? That's just a choice that they have made. I will say that there are a number of communities, especially closer to bodies of water, where this is going to become a really sensitive issue with climate change. Right? As the water table rises with sea level rise, wells and septic systems will be compromised. And so there are areas where we shouldn't be expanding housing or commercial development, and we may need to relocate people because it's just not sustainable. You know, distinguishing between the places that genuinely can't expand their infrastructure and the places that choose not to do it may be a little bit harder, but you know, that's a conversation the state should be having and thinking about the policy levers they have.
Fantastic. And then that kind of leads into the next level, on the federal level. Do you see other kind of policy solutions or things that we should be considering the federal level to support more affordable housing development across the country?
I mean, the best thing the federal government could do is make housing vouchers an entitlement and just provide funding for everybody who needs it. You know, talk to your federal reps. That's not going to get through Congress anytime soon, but it's worth continuing to flag this. And every time there's a budget, you know, trying to get more funding for direct household subsidies in the most flexible possible way. The Biden administration has tried doing sort of smaller versions of the MBTA communities, offering discretionary planning grants for places that want to do transit infrastructure upgrades, and making this essentially contingent on doing some zoning analysis. So if if the federal government provides money for a light rail for bus rapid transit, the local government needs to allow development to happen around it, including relatively dense housing. Those are still very new, they're quite small, and I don't think we have evidence. But if those work out, it would be great to see that expanded.
And it seems like that's something that Massachusetts could do when we expand the MBTA. The similar requirement is that we have a similar requirement with the communities that are benefiting from the new stations.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much. That's what we have. That covers a lot. There's still a lot going on in the chat, but I'm gonna just thank you, both Callie and Jenny, and I'm gonna transfer or turn this over to my colleague Emma to wrap us up.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Callie, for leading such a thoughtful discussion. Thank you, Jenny, for your thoughts and insights. I always learn so much from you. So we will take a quick break for about 5 minutes and we'll come back at 11:35. This discussion was a lovely kind of segue into hearing an update on the Complete Neighborhoods initiative here at MHP, which we'll provide an update on in these final sessions. So we will have a 5-minute break and we will see you back here at 11:35. Welcome back, everyone. We will now hear updates on two programs that are part of MHP's Complete Neighborhoods Initiative. We will first hear from Christine, Senior Development Manager, and we will then hear from Katy Lacy, our Senior Planner. There will be time for questions at the end, so please put your questions in the chat. And Christine, you are up.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Sounds good. All right, great.
Yes.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone had a great first two sessions. Those were really informative. Really loved the talk that Jenny gave. I think a lot of the material that she mentioned around transient-oriented development, we will also be touching on that for the next hour. So I'm going to be sharing my screen. Give that another try. Off my game today. Right. So my name is Christine Madore. I'm the Senior Development Manager here at Massachusetts Housing Partnership. I'm really glad to be sharing an update on the Complete Neighborhoods Initiative today with you all. And before we get started, I wanted to provide some background about Complete Neighborhoods Initiative. The Complete Neighborhoods Initiative was funded by the Economic Development Bond Bill of 2021. The bill authorized $50 million over 5 years to support building housing near transit areas. So we took some time to think about how to design a program to support this work. And we wanted to tackle our biggest challenges at its intersection. They're climate change, transportation, and housing. So with this program, we created 3 specific efforts to support those outcomes. And the first one is the 3ATA that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The program is designed to support cities and towns, the 177 cities and towns that are considered MBTA communities, in complying with Section 3A, the MBTA community zoning, where each community must adopt a district that allows multifamily housing by right near transit areas. The second program is the Complete Neighborhoods Partnership that I'm overseeing, then I will talk about more later on. And lastly, we do have a capital investment program where the majority of this funding is devoted to help subsidize building housing near transit areas. So what is a complete neighborhood? You might be thinking. A complete neighborhood is a neighborhood where it's built at the human scale. Anyone who's living in a complete neighborhood can access their daily needs, their essential needs, without getting into a car. They have the option to drive, but it is not a prerequisite to live in a complete neighborhood. And so your daily essential needs include housing, your job, going to school, and that also includes your amenities, public parks and institutions in the neighborhood, places where you can go shopping and get your essential services, like going to the hair salon, without getting into a car. So much of this work is modeled after other places that have been using this planning model to plan for their communities. One is an example from Portland. They also call it the complete neighborhood. And another one is called a 20-minute neighborhood that you can see here that is being implemented in Melbourne, Australia. The Complete Neighborhoods Partnership Program has 4 main goals. The work is provided to support these 4 main goals to increase economic opportunity for disadvantaged populations, create inclusive neighborhoods, create dense, compact, connected neighborhoods, and reduce auto dependency. When we first started out the program, and when we opened up the program for application to communities, we really wanted to find out what each community see as the recipe for their success. So we are providing technical services and meeting the communities where they are so they could implement strategies to accelerate public and private investments to build affordable housing near transit areas and mobility hubs. And there are four main ways that we provide these services. Community capacity building, so that is a lot about planning and being proactive about how to create a community that will ultimately look like a complete neighborhood. Inclusive and equitable growth, a lot of community engagement that Lily had touched on earlier this morning, that is part of this program as well. Readiness for investment is focused on pre-development work, due diligence, developing RFPs, providing architectural test bits, and finally, we also provide support for property owners or cities and towns that have surplus land that they would just like to understand whether this is financially feasible or housing should be developed on the property. And our first cohort was selected back in June of last year. So we are officially in the second year of this program. Each cohort is with us for 2.5 years. The full program is for 5 years. So we are actually opening up for another round this fall. But since last year, we have been working with 11 communities, 3 of which are gateway cities, and there are 2 regions that have partnered up to take on this work. There are 12 service providers that are actively supporting these communities on the work that I mentioned earlier, 13 projects that are currently in progress or scoping, 8 of which are considered planning or zoning projects, and 5 are more focused on pre-development and financial feasibility. About 2/3 of the program, round 1 program budget has been committed so far, and the average project budget of each project is just under $50,000. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes to talk about what each community in this first cohort is working on and talk about the next steps. First up is West Chelsea. This is a gateway city that was pretty hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, and they have been doing a lot of work around station area planning. For Chelsea, we select Barrett Planning Group, Judy Barrett and her team, to look at how they can comply with the new MBTA community zoning law. And as part of that work, they would like to expand the transit-oriented development zoning overlay to a bigger area to unlock additional housing potential in the area. And lastly, they are also looking into amending their urban renewal plan as part of this work, because their original urban renewal plan did not include provisions for affordable housing. So all of these projects together will help the city provide more housing opportunities at all ranges of income and household types. Next, we're heading into Brockton, which is also another gateway city. Brockton is a majority city, does have 3 commuter rail stations, and our work for complete neighborhoods is focused on the Capello station area. And the departure of their major shoe manufacturing industry has really contributed to the disinvestment and decline of this neighborhood. But the neighborhood is still very walkable, and the walkable scale has been preserved despite the dominance of auto-oriented uses since the industry left, so over the past 50 or 60 years. When we first started meeting with the steering committee and the stakeholders in Capello, we heard very clearly that they would like to see vibrancy return to this area. But the zoning along Capello is not aligned at all with that vision. So we decided to build on the visioning work that they did for the neighborhood back in 2018 to actually develop a more robust master plan that has all the pieces and components that support and facilitate a real complete neighborhood. For Campello, we selected the architect Studio Luz, along with Emily Ennis and RKG Associates to do this work as a joint consulting team. We're starting off with the Campello Neighborhood Master Plan, and part of this work is also helping the city comply with MBTA zoning for Campello Station area. They also would like to create an urban renewal plan for Campello, as well as take on form-based code development, and finally, maybe consider adopting district improvement financing for this area. Next, we have Fitchburg. Fitchburg is also a gateway city that has seen a lot of investment, both public and private, in recent years, but they really see that housing continues to be the missing piece for Fitchburg to become, for downtown Fitchburg to become a true complete neighborhood. So the work that we're focusing on in Fitchburg is very much focused on redevelopment of private properties to build more housing on second or upper levels that are vacant and could be turned into housing. The first project that we took on is at 329 Main Street development. We're currently in the cost estimate phase, and we're excited to see this project move forward. And because it is an MBTA community, we're also supporting Fitchburg and helping them comply with the new zoning law. And for this team, we selected SB Design as the architect. We have Stone Soup Collaborative. Morsongas is the lead consultant. And we also have Dream Collaborative to work on the zoning work. Next, we have a regional partnership, North Attleboro and Plainville. So North Attleboro recently received a $4.5 million MassWorks grant to improve the traffic flow at this intersection called Callie Boulevard. And we thought it was a great opportunity to leverage that resource to create a kind of neighborhood-wide district and starting from scratch to build a complete neighborhood starting from scratch. For this partnership was selected Kittleson Associates and Dream Collaborative again to work on the zoning. So Kittleson is a consultant that is really strong in planning and transportation planning. So we thought this was a really good partnership. For this area, Callie Boulevard, as you can see, there's a lot of single-use strip malls and commercial uses. And both towns would really like to see this area to become a more walkable, livable neighborhood. And even though there's no clear transit area here, there is a regional transit stop that serves this area. So when we're talking about MBTA communities and transit-oriented development, we are looking beyond supporting communities that are not traditionally as we think of transit-oriented development. We want to be able to create the housing density that could justify transit service to the area. So this is one place where we're doing that. And finally, the partnership in Franklin County, the 6 communities for this partnership are Greenfield, Deerfield, Orange, Irving, Whately, and Montague. None of these are MBTA communities, and these communities wouldn't be the first ones you think of when we talk about transit-oriented development, but they do have a very robust regional transit service, the FERDA network. So we thought this was a really great candidate to build a set of complete neighborhoods. Starting with FERCOG, the Franklin Regional Council of Governments, we are funding their work to look at regional zoning and see if there are barriers to creating more housing due to zoning, and come up with a set of best practices to help these communities overcome those barriers. And each of these communities are also taking on projects of their own. In Montague, the town has recently received a piece of property that used to be the Farron Hospital along Montague City Road. And that building is being torn down, and the town saw it as a great opportunity to create a village from the ground up, quite literally, So we're supporting their work to come up with a plan to proactively plan for not just housing, but building a neighborhood around that housing. In Whately, they have a vacant property that was burned down many years ago that's sitting vacant. It is close to a FERDA transit stop. And so we're helping them do some due diligence and next steps, perhaps supporting them with developing the RFP. In Orange, they do have an armory building that is sitting vacant that we're supporting them with some early due diligence and architectural test bits. In Greenfield, we're working with a property developer at 176 Main, and we have been looking at test bits to build housing above the current building and additional housing in the back of the parking lot, in the back of the building. And this is in a downtown area. In Deerfield, in South Deerfield, there is a municipal campus where they have several municipal buildings that are underutilized, and we're helping them look at the area of more of a village type. So helping them with the master plan of that village. And finally, in Irving, we're helping them develop an RFP, and that RFP is pretty much final at this moment, and they're ready to issue that for more housing at this location. So all of these properties and locations are near regional transit stops. And the team that we have brought on for Franklin County is Coon Riddle Architects and MHP. So those are all the projects. I'm happy to take questions about any of them afterwards, and also invite anyone from any of the communities or service providers, consultants that are on the call today to jump in with their takeaways or experiences so far in their communities and working with MHP. But I wanted to share some key takeaways so far on the program design and implementation. So we learned that there are many grant opportunities out there at all levels to take on planning, pre-development work, but I have found that longer term targeted investments are really key to build progress. Rather than supporting projects, one-time projects, and then ending it and then crossing your fingers and hoping something will happen, really key here is that you're with the community every step of the way, all the way from planning to pre-development and implementation, to really build on the progress to make sure that the outcomes that we are looking for that we are actually driving those outcomes. And proactively targeting communities during application phase. Throughout this work, we could have just put out our application openly and say, if anyone's interested, please apply. But with this program specifically, we wanted to target communities that we felt were a good fit for the program and encourage them to apply. There are some communities that maybe on the surface feel like they don't have the capacity to take on this work, which is why the work that we do to complete neighborhoods is that we're meeting the communities where they are to make sure that we understand that they have specific needs that we can support and meet with our set of consultants. And encouraging regional collaboration where partnerships already exist. Even though we would like to see regional partnerships for this program, we didn't want to force communities to work together. We would really like to see partnerships that already existed so that there's already infrastructure or any kind of political capital that's in place for the projects to be implemented more smoothly. Because even though if you're just working on a planning project right now, down the road, you're going to need zoning support and community engagement, especially when it becomes, if it's across multiple communities, you really need that regional collaboration that takes time to build. And we may not be able to afford building that coalition from the beginning. Setting expectations and transparency around the use of funding. I think this is one key question that I get all the time is, what can we do with this funding? Will you just write us a check? And I think that's one of the things that surprise communities most is that no, and my answer is always no, I can't write you a check, but I could pay a consultant to do the work so that you don't have to write a check, and being very clear about the type of work that we can take on for the community, being flexible and nimble about it has been really successful. And what we did before the program initiated is to recruit a group of consultants that are experienced and have a lot of expertise around planning, zoning, architects, and real estate development financing. So having those consultants in place before we take on the projects and the program overall really help us explain to the applicants and our communities what kind of work that is ready to go without going out to procure a specific consultant for the work. And finally, embracing opportunities to cultivate new areas of expertise for consultants. One of the ways that we've done this is to train consultants on 3A, on MBTA zoning. And I think that has been really successful so that we are creating a new crop of consultants that can do this analysis. So some thoughts on program implementation. I think for communities that have pre-development projects, it's really important to be flexible and meet them where they're at and identify the critical path early on. Because when you're doing pre-development and due diligence work, something could always come up and you have to pivot. So being flexible is really key here. And I haven't had any significant examples to talk about at this point. So I'm knocking on wood on that. But I think being responsive and meeting the communities where they're at has been really positive. And I touched on this a little bit already, being nimble around unexpected changes in local political environment and market conditions. I've had a few scenarios where a project at the beginning seemed very promising. And a few months later, the owner would say, sorry, I don't want to do this anymore. So it's disappointing and it could create some early losses in terms of program implementation and funding. But I think setting up your expectations early could really help with that. Being intentional about creating steering committees. I think some of the ways where we went about creating steering committees is that in the beginning, I wanted steering committees for everyone, but not all of them could be engaged at every single level. So being intentional about what roles they will take on in the beginning could be very helpful. Relying on external partners for advice. I do this a lot. I call out my partners at Mass Housing and Mass Development, MAPC for advice, because this work, we can't take it on alone. And I'm very aware that there are other agencies that are doing similar work. So we can all work together towards the same goals that would amplify our impact. And finally, holding in-person meetings. I feel like we have taken that for granted over the past several years. When I am in some of these in-person meetings, I can see there's social capital that's being built just by watching people talking to each other. And that's really the groundwork that Lily was talking about during the first session, is that you really need to start building your coalition early and to lay the groundwork for anything that might need your support later on. And I think Zoom is really convenient, virtual meetings are really convenient, but definitely don't take in-person meetings for granted. If it's possible to hold in-person meetings, make it easy for people to come. Think about the time of the day, the materials and translation so that people can easily attend. I have seen that that's been really positive to have in-person meetings. And so, like I said earlier, our program is open for a second round of funding this fall. I don't have a specific date yet, but if you have any interest or questions about the program, feel free to ask me now or reach out to me afterward at cmadore@mhp.net or give me a call. And that's it.
Thanks so much, Christine. That was so exciting to hear the updates and all that work that the communities have been doing. We have had a few questions come in. Could you talk about how the experience of doing this work differs across the wide range of community types that you're working in?
I think the different community types have been fascinating. There are communities where they've been doing planning and development for a long time, like the city of Brockton. They know exactly what they need to do to drive housing production and the kind of planning activity, the stakeholders they need to reach out to have effective community engagement. And compared to, Franklin County, there's 6 communities, and because they're smaller, more rural communities, the capacity for planning and development isn't always there. So that required a lot more kind of hands-on from me, which I didn't mind. I actually enjoy it very much. But it's been really great to see that all the communities, even though they're very different, they have different goals, that some of the motivation for them to participate in this program is the same, is that our community members, they want to be able to live in neighborhoods, regardless of their ability and their ages, to be able to just walk out the door, go to coffee shops and go shopping and, see my grandchildren or see my grandparents and to have families living in a place that, it's very age friendly and livable. And that's been the kind of common thread for all the communities. They would like to see vibrancy in the communities and not having to own a car and drive everywhere.
That's great. Another question came in about if any of these properties are privately owned, and if so, how the owners were encouraged to participate in the process.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way that our program works is that with private properties, because we cannot use public funding for private benefit, the way we have worked with private owners is that we create a forgivable loan. It's like a loan note where we set up a very informal agreement where we will provide you with this technical service. So for example, I see Anna had chimed in the comments. In the case of 176 Main Street in Greenfield, we provided the architect's technical services and asked that the owner, Tim Grader, produce affordable units as part of the project. And if he does do that, if the project does produce affordable units, then his repayment obligation is forgiven. And if not, he has to pay us back. But either way, we feel that this early investment is worth it so that we can understand whether the project is feasible or not. And so that's how we've been working with private property owners.
Great, thank you. And are there any thoughts you'd like to share on how the program is measuring the impact of implementation?
Yeah, and I honestly haven't been tracking the impact so much because we haven't had that much impact to track right now, because we're focused on planning and pre-development. Most of the work that we've been doing has been outcome focused rather than impact. So for example, private properties that have housing projects proposed, in the case of Greenfield and Fitchburg, we're kind of still in the feasibility phase. So it's not, it'll be challenging to measure the impact, but we're hoping that the outcome is more affordable units near transit areas. So TBD.
Thanks, Christine. That was a really exciting update. And I will now turn it over to Katy, who will give us an update on her program. So Katy, if you want to put your slides up, I will add you here to the screen. And you can take it away when you're ready.
Let me just get the sound set up. Oops.
Katie, I can also share if that's helpful.
No, that's good. Just give me a minute.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. Everyone got that?
You can see it, yeah.
I am gonna just make double sure we can hear it. In any case, my name's Katy Lacy, Senior Planner with MHP's Community Assistance Division, and I'm gonna just give a brief overview of the MHP's, our Technical Assistance Program for MBTA communities. And I'm guessing a lot of you are here from the 177 MBTA communities. So I'm not going to go into all the details of the guidelines, but in summary, the law requires all MBTA communities create a zoning district of reasonable size in which multifamily housing at 15 units an acre is permitted as of right. And the guidelines provide a lot of great information. The link is at the end of this about how communities can comply. And the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, the agency formerly known as DHCD, has done an amazing job getting the word out. But before, so I'm going to leave that to the side. But before we go through how we are helping, I just wanted everyone to take a pause and just talk a little bit about why we're doing this and why it's important. So I'm hoping that this sound is going to work. Can you hear that?
We all love Massachusetts, but finding a place to live is close to impossible. We don't build enough homes or offer enough housing choices. This limits availability to those who are looking for a house they can afford, and to those looking to start new careers, grow families, or begin a new chapter in their lives. Our neighborhoods are built out on large single-family lots that eat away at natural places that we love so much. This means we live farther from school, work, and other daily needs, forcing us to drive everywhere. We spend more time in our cars, adding to the pollution that harms our health and the environment. It also means that our region is more racially segregated, less welcoming, and less diverse, as a lack of housing choice limits where low and moderate income families can afford to live. But there is some good news. Massachusetts is trying to change this. A new law requires 175 communities in Greater Boston to zone for more housing near public transit stations. These new zoning districts offer many benefits. They encourage building more housing choices that consume less land, increasing what's available and affordable, and making these places more inclusive. They encourage communities that are transit-oriented, putting those new homes near transit stations and walkable downtowns, supporting public transportation and access to jobs. This means less time in the car, reducing traffic and pollution, and promoting better health. They encourage complete neighborhoods, which brings people closer not only to daily destinations like work and school, but daily needs like stores, restaurants, and public places, where people can gather and participate in the neighborhood's growing prosperity. Once full compliance is reached with this new law, it could mean 280,000 more homes and a lot more housing choice. These additional homes will help us address the housing, transportation, and climate needs of the Commonwealth, while making our communities more diverse and vibrant. The naysayers think this new law will turn our beloved downtowns into skyscraper cities. But here's the truth. It encourages us to build what we used to, downtowns where everyone can go to mingle and walk to whatever they need. Massachusetts has some great walkable and transit-oriented communities with complete neighborhoods. With smart land use planning, we can make more of these places we love and used to build, benefiting existing residents and creating more opportunities for those who have historically been left on the margins. The Massachusetts Housing Partnership is working with the state to give us the tools and support we need to make this happen. Let's build this future together. Visit our website to learn more.
All right. with that tearjerker. I always just think it's good to sort of pause and say, why? Why are we doing this? So how did we respond to this? MHP responded in 3 ways: through policy development, education, and direct technical assistance. And we were not alone. There are other agencies, certainly HLC has been a leader in helping people with this. But in terms of policy development, since we were established, we've been advocating for zoning reform. As far back as 2013, MHP proposed state legislation requiring all communities to have multifamily housing in appropriate districts. With the adoption of 3A, our leadership on our group collaborated a lot with DHCD, HLC to shape the MBTA community's guidelines for compliance. And education included the development of universal resources like that great little movie we just saw to help people understand the law and what was required. We did a multi-part webinar series, and our Center for Housing Data helped a lot played a critical role, I'd say, in the development of the compliance model that is going to be used to help communities comply. And finally, we geared up to launch our technical assistance program. So here it is at a glance. We designed it to be as effective and accessible as possible, modeling it very closely after a successful 40B TA program that's been in operation for 20 years. As Christine mentioned, thanks to Christine, we had 18 pre-qualified consultants, and we trained them. We worked carefully with HLC to train them so that they really knew what was going to be required, the technical aspect of it. We had it available on a rolling basis after a while, after an initial thrust of applications, and we tried to design a very low threshold application process. We hoped these would be short-term projects, 6 months and no more than $20,000. We gave out about 50 plus grants in 2023, and we're currently working with 75 communities. And we're really fortunate to have gotten money from the Department of Transportation, the Bar Foundation, and HLC to support this work. We limited the scope of work that we would support to focus on helping planners and elected boards wrestle with the more technical aspects of the guidelines. So we really put the technical in technical assistance, providing a solid understanding of what was required and how a community could comply before, so that they could carry this out for the public discussion. We knew that was going to be the hard work. So some of this involved, depending on the community, educating and informing. Depending on the, some communities really had planning staff that got out in front, were telling everyone what was required. Other people were like, what the heck's going on? In which case the consultant could jump in and get involved. We helped communities, our consultants helped communities identify district locations. Many times communities had a sense of where they wanted this district to be, but quick review of master plans, housing production plans, even just their zoning map that showed sort of denser areas or a 40R district were a good starting place. Other communities, some that have no multifamily at all, were starting from scratch. Helping to figure out the district location was particularly challenging for the rapid transit and commuter rail stations, because there was not just a requirement to have a district, but parts of it had to be, a certain amount had to be within certain proximity to the actual station. So that became a more complicated exercise. We helped them look at district size. The guidelines require a minimum. It's different for every district, but let's just start with 50 acres. And so many communities put forth a bunch of options, and the consultant was able to say, this one would work, as you can see on this one wouldn't, or you could mix and match and put together, parts of different districts. one of the requirements is that at least half of the district has to be in one contiguous area. And then there can be sub-districts that are at least 5 acres in size. This was the really hard part, I think. You know, at some point, in order to make this all work, the consultants had to work with the communities to figure out what kind of zoning parameters they could live with. Could they stand a 4-story building? Could they stand a 0 lot line, no floor area ratio? What were, you know, 1 parking space, 2 parking space? And these are really tough discussions in communities that think of themselves as rural or suburban. So there was a lot of rinse and repeat on this exercise. Frequently communities would say, you know, if we get this to go up to 4 stories, we could do it in a lot smaller area. So that was good. And then finally, the consultants we had ran the numbers, put them in this compliance model to make double sure that the areas being proposed looks like they complied with the acreage, the unit capacity, the density per acre. Again, this was all preliminary. Everything has to go to HLC for a final compliance review, but it just got them kind of pointed in the right direction before going into the public discussion period. Sorry about that pink line. Some consultants got as far as helping communities actually turn this into zoning language that would come up as a bylaw or ordinance amendment. You know, great. Often communities use their town council. In this case, it was ready to get sent out there for review. And then finally, we are well aware that getting the sort of technical ducks in a row is just the first step in what's going to be a very long journey. We are supporting the wonderful work Lily's doing with CHAPA through their assistance program for MBTA communities. They're currently working with 42 communities on a very labor-intensive cohort-based model. So we're very grateful they're involved as well. And I think, and as Lily pointed out, the focus of this is to kind of start building community level support for this. So again, the focus of our program has been kind of getting everyone's technical ducks in a row, getting elected leaders, planners with a really good understanding of what the assignment is, knowing that this was just the beginning of the public discussion. So I'm going to leave you with a question that my wonderful colleague Shelley sent me via Teams. So I just quoted this. I had a conversation with a resident from town X. They really wanted to discuss MBTA zoning and her concerns about it. She lives near the commuter rail, describes the area as having, it already has smaller homes on smaller lots. What if a developer buys up all the land, tears it down, merges the parcel, and builds at 15 acres? And Shelley said, what do I say? And I have to confess, my initial response was, darn, I got to get my elevator speech in order. Because the fact is, even though I know it's the right thing to do, you know, we all need to kind of work on getting our values agenda sorted out. We can minimize saying it's just zoning. Jenny Schuetz noted it's good news for those that don't want to see change because it takes a long time, and it's bad news for housing advocates. But the fact is, diversifying potentially elite white neighborhoods and allowing more density may bring change. There may be more students. There may be more traffic. There may be more demand for public services, particularly our public schools. We don't know. You know, the future is uncertain. So I'm going to end with a call to action. As housing advocates and local boots on the ground, we've all got to be getting ready to prepare to explain and defend not just the nuts and bolts of the 3A guidelines, but the dire need for zoning reform. So what is our personal values statement? Why do we believe in this? Talk to friends, family, community members. I'm very happy this has been sort of a consistent theme in this today's presentation, and I'm ending with that too. we're lucky to be in a moment of amazing new information. Amy Dane was mentioned, Jenny's work, the Boston Globe, to help us prepare our elevator speech. I'm personally finding that Just Action, which is the sequel to The Color of Law, remember that book we all ran out and bought after George Floyd? This is sort of a how-to manual, has been an amazing source for sort of helping me tone it up. And Shelley, I'm sorry, I'm honestly still working on it, but there are so many reasons: climate change, racial justice, expanding access to opportunities. But let's all join forces on this campaign. So with that, I will close. And thank you, guys.
Thank you, Katie, for that wonderful update on all that's been going on with 3ATA.
One thing I did forget to mention is some key metrics. Oh yeah, I know I did say that. We're working, it's now getting close to 80 communities. So I'm very happy with that. It's been a rapid deployment. It's been all hands on deck. Everyone on our team has been working on this, so.
That's great. Someone did chime in the chat about that quote that you shared about whether there's real precedent for that type of development, the kind of tear down, rebuild. And just noting that it seems like it may be hard to pull off financially and logistically. So just wanted to highlight that as an additional insight on that quote. And then something else, just if you could touch on this, it seems like there had been a lot of fear and anxiety when the guidelines first came out. What are you seeing now that communities are moving toward compliance?
It took a little while, but I'm amazed. I mean, I think the message is really getting across. CHAPA, MEI, Making the Case Call recently just did a fantastic session with the folks from Lexington. And it was really the community members talking. It wasn't the staff, and they really got it. They got the guidelines, they got how they could be used, how they couldn't be used. The other thing is that I hope these things work out, because I've been surprised to find out as we end this fiscal year and some of our projects are wrapping up, a bunch of stealth communities went ahead and passed stuff at town meeting that I wasn't even aware of. So I'm feeling like people get it and they're moving forward. So we've been kind of pleasantly surprised. We'll see.
Another question came in that I think would be helpful for you to weigh in on is if units that are currently on site aren't counted toward compliance, what could be built with the new zoning? Won't many single family houses go away and be replaced with apartment buildings? Is there anything you would weigh in on that?
I don't think we know what the future brings. I mean, I think that is the exact question that Shelley's posed. You know, existing buildings don't count. It's what it's zoned for underneath. There is the potential that that could change. It's really up to the community to shape what would go back there should the buildings get torn down, to make it something that is palatable. Also, I do hear this a lot about, you know, a developer is going to get the land and build it. It's a two-way street. I mean, developers can't just take land, right? There has to be sort of a decision and a landowner wanting to sell it and that kind of thing. So I don't have a firm answer to that. I think things can change.
And is there anything else as we wrap up that you'd like to weigh in on with future application rounds?
I think we're thinking we might expand the scope to help out to the need, you know, to the extent it's needed. HLC has really been quite lavish with assistance on this. So
can you clarify what HLC means, Katie?
Yes, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. I'm still practicing this. Formerly DHCD. I think we're trying to maybe expand it that we could assist communities with the economic feasibility analysis associated with the inclusionary requirement. and maybe to go a little deeper with community engagement, depending on the need. And the other thing is there still are a whole bunch of other communities that we haven't heard from, but if anyone wants to apply, the link is at the end of this presentation in your binder.
Great. Thanks so much, Katie. So as we wrap up today, I wanted to thank you all for attending today's sessions. Thank you for your thoughtful questions and the robust discussion in the chat. Also, thank you to our presenters and speakers for sharing your expertise and insights with all of us. I know I learned a lot today, and it's always exciting to hear what folks have to say and share. So thank you for all of that. I know we had some technical glitches, so thank you all for your patience, and did want to assure you all that there will be a recording posted by the end of this week. So if you missed bits and pieces, we will have a recording posted. Also, if you would like to save the chat, there's 3 little dots in the bottom left of the chat, and it will give you the option to save the chat if you'd like to refer back to this later. And tomorrow, we're looking forward to welcoming many of you back to Devon's for day 2 of this year's Housing Institute. We will also be presenting our Housing Hero Awards, and it will be very exciting to do that back in person. Registration begins at 8:30 in the morning, and more details can be found in the binder and the agenda. My colleague Christine has also put a link to our evaluation form. So before you, before you jump off, if you could complete that and just share your thoughts with us, that would be very helpful. And thank you all again for joining. And we look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow in Devon's. And have safe travels. Thank you all again for joining us.